This happened not even a month ago. I'm a senior in high school, and I've lived in Nevada my whole life. There's not a whole lot to do here, but one thing my friends and I have always been into is urban exploring. We'd look for abandoned buildings, old service tunnels, dead malls, anything that felt forgotten. We'd climb through broken fences, take pictures, sometimes sneak up to the roofs or down into basements. It wasn't about breaking stuff or doing anything illegal. It was just about the vibe. The only guy in our group who always found the weirdest places was Charles. He was kind of the quiet, mysterious type. He'd show up with locations none of us had heard of. Half the time, I didn't even ask how he found them. One day, he sent us a screenshot from some sketchy Instagram account. Low follower account, blurry photos, all kinds of creepy comments under the posts. The caption on the post in question just said something like, "Dozens of abandoned mine shafts in the Mojave Desert if you know where to look." According to Charles, he had been in contact with the account, and whoever was running it had given him some areas to check out. That's all Charles needed. He was instantly obsessed with the idea. So that Saturday, it was me, Charles, and our other friend James. I had a Wrangler that was perfect for off-road desert driving, so we took that. We didn't have a specific address or anything, just a general area and a pin drop somewhere in the middle of the Mojave. The spot Charles had marked was way off in the desert, like really far from anything. We turned off the main road almost half an hour earlier, and the dirt path we were on barely looked like a road anymore. We drove around for what felt like forever. No signs, no structures, no landmarks, just endless nothing. I kept checking my phone, even though I knew we didn't have service. James was in the back, getting more and more irritated. He started telling Charles this whole thing was a waste of time, and that he had been scammed by some troll account. Charles insisted that we keep looking, so we did. He's always been stubborn with navigation, so I figured I'd indulge him a little while longer. Eventually, just as we were about to call it quits, James pointed out something off to the right. At first, it looked like just more rock and sand, but as we got closer, we saw it. This half-collapsed wooden structure built into the side of a slope. Part of the entrance looked like it had been caved in, but you could still see a dark hole behind the support beams. It wasn't huge, but it was definitely man-made, definitely a mine shaft. Charles didn't say anything at first. He just pulled out his phone, opened the offline map he'd downloaded when we still had service, and dropped a pin on it. Then he turned to James and said, "Told you," to which James said he just got lucky. But even I had to admit, it was kind of crazy. We'd been driving in circles out in the middle of nowhere, and somehow, we'd actually found one. I parked a few yards from the entrance, just off to the side on a flat patch of dirt. We all climbed out and geared up. Charles had even brought masks for us to wear. The three of us walked up the mine, and it looked even sketchier up close. Charles picked up a rock and tossed it in. We waited. A few seconds later, we heard it clang 3 times. Then nothing. It was really deep. Charles looked back at us and said if we tripped on the way down, we were probably dead. We started the descent. Luckily, the shaft wasn't a straight drop. It sloped down at a steep angle, but not enough that we had to climb hand over hand. The ground was loose and uneven, and there were old wooden beams lining parts of the wall. Surprisingly, they seemed pretty sturdy. The deeper we went, the colder it got, and quieter. It was really eerie down there. We couldn't even see any light coming through from the entrance anymore. Eventually, we made it to what felt like the bottom. The shaft leveled out and opened into a wider tunnel that branched off in a few directions. It looked exactly how you'd imagine. Old support beams every few yards, rusted rails half buried in dirt, and a thick layer of dust on everything. There were scraps of wood and metal scattered around, maybe parts of old carts or tools. It smelled kind of stale in there, if that made any sense. Honestly, I didn't realize how much of a blessing the masks were until that point. We picked a tunnel and just started walking. None of us really said much. We weren't looking for anything specific, just exploring. There honestly wasn't much cool stuff down there. The place looked like it had been mostly cleaned out of anything worth taking. But then we heard something. It was faint, somewhere further down the tunnel. It sounded like something being dragged. At first, I thought I imagined it, but I looked over and saw Charles had stopped too. James motioned for us to turn off our flashlights, so we did. We just stood there in total darkness, listening. The sound came again. It was a sort of scraping sounds, like metal or maybe even wood being dragged along the ground. It was hard to tell with the echo, but it seemed like whatever it was getting closer. We stood there in the dark for maybe 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. It was hard to tell. The scraping sound kept coming, slowly getting louder. It didn't sound too close to us, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. Then, James accidentally flicked his flashlight on and then off again. I wanted to kill him. The scraping stopped and everything went silent. Then, out of nowhere, there was this loud metallic clang from somewhere deep in the tunnel. Like whatever was being dragged had just been dropped. And right after that came the most awful, demonic scream I'd ever heard. It barely sounded human. We turned and ran, not even caring about how loud we were being. I've never run faster in my entire life. I could hear footsteps coming from somewhere behind me, and I thought I was going to have a panic attack. I was in the back trying to keep up, and then I tripped on something. One of my shoes came off, and I struggled to stay upright. I didn't have time to go back for it, so I just kept going, trying to ignore the pain in my foot. Up ahead, Charles and James had already reached the incline and were climbing. I practically threw myself up the stairs. When I tell you climbing those stairs half barefoot was the most painful thing I'd ever experienced, I'm not exaggerating. It was excruciating. I picked up a new splinter every few seconds. If not for the adrenaline coursing through my veins, I don't think I would have been able to make it out of there. By the time I finally made it out into the open air, my foot was shot. I needed James and Charles to damn near carry me over to the car. I couldn't drive like that, so James jumped in the driver's seat. I barely got the door closed before he threw it in gear and floored it. I don't think we were followed up the shaft, but we weren't sticking around to find out. We drove in silence all the way to the nearest hospital. I thought the pain was going to make me pass out. I ended up having to get a tetanus shot, and even after all my wounds were cleaned and all the splinters were removed, I couldn't walk normally for days. A few days later, once I could walk without limping too bad, James told us he'd dropped his wallet somewhere near the shaft, probably when he was helping me get to the car. He hadn't said anything at the time, but now he figured it was worth going back. Just to the entrance, no way were we going back inside. So the three of us drove back out there using the pin that Charles had saved. Obviously, James's wallet was nowhere in sight, but we did find something. My shoe. It was sitting a few feet from the mine's entrance. I cautiously walked over to it and picked it up. It was torn up, like someone, or dare I say something, had bitten into it. There were literally teeth marks in my shoe, and entire chunks of it were missing. We didn't stick around much longer after that. None of us can come up with any rational explanation. You might be quick to just say it was some homeless person living down there, but if that were the case, how the hell had they managed to stay alive for so long? There was no food down there. What in the world would they eat? Charles said that Instagram account never responded to him when he DM'd him about what happens. It's going to be a long time before I do any urban exploring in the desert again. I've always been a rugged kind of guy. I've always loved the outdoors, and a vacation to me is a camping or fishing trip, not some extravagant excursion to some resort or something. My girlfriend of 6 months shares my love of nature. That's probably one of the main reasons we started dating, if I had to be honest. A couple weeks back, Tiki and I decided to do something a little different. We drove out to the desert to camp for a few days. We'd both done forests, mountains, lakes, all that, but neither of us had really experienced the kind of open, silent, dry isolation the desert offered. It just felt like something we had to try at least once. One of the main reasons we landed on the desert, too, was the stargazing. That's something we both love, probably more than anything else. Even back when we first started dating, we'd take drives out past town just to lie in the hood of the truck and watch the stars. So when we read that this spot was far from any towns or light pollution, it was basically a done deal. I found a place online that was supposedly remote but legal to camp on. No amenities, just open land, some fire rings, and stars. Sounded perfect. We packed up the truck with our gear and made the 3-hour drive early that Friday morning. The last hour or so was on a dirt road that felt like it went on forever. There wasn't a house or sign of human life in sight. Honestly, that was half the appeal. By the time we found the campsite, it was already late afternoon. The place was completely void of people, just as I had hoped. The first couple nights were exactly what we wanted. Warm days, cool nights, clear skies. We'd sit out by the fire with a couple drinks, pass a little joint back and forth, and just talk about dumb stuff or lie back and stare at the sky. Not having a schedule or any distractions was really refreshing. And yeah, we'd fool around a bit in the tent. That was all part of the fun too. It felt good to be disconnected. Both nights though, we heard something strange. Not close, just somewhere way out in the distance. It was this low, drawn-out sound, like a howl or a moan. It didn't really sound like a person, more like an animal. The first night, we both sort of paused when we heard it. Tiki looked at me like, "Did you hear that too?" And I nodded. But we ended up laughing it off. I said it was probably a coyote or a mountain lion or something, and she agreed. Same thing the second night, right around the same time too. We chalked it up to being desert wildlife. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff out here that we're not used to hearing. It was unsettling, sure, but we weren't going to let it ruin the trip. The third night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. It was soft at first, just a couple faint crunches, like someone walking slowly over dry dirt. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't an animal. It was too steady and slow. I didn't move. I wanted to grab the flashlight, wake Tiki up, and say something, but I couldn't. I was frozen. My heart was pounding and every muscle in my body felt locked up. The steps didn't go around the tent. They just stopped a few feet away, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. I stared at the ceiling of the tent, barely blinking, waiting to hear something else. But whoever or whatever it was didn't make another sound. I waited there for God knows how long, praying they'd walk away. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a flick. That sharp, unmistakable sound of a lighter. A small orange glow appeared through the fabric of the tent, maybe waist height, a few feet off to the side. Whoever was out there held the flame steady for a few seconds, then started waving it around slowly. I didn't move. I just stared at it, trying not to make a sound. And then the flame got bigger, way bigger. It went from a flicker to a glow, like they'd lit something, a torch maybe. Then, without warning, the person dropped whatever they were holding. I heard it hit the dirt with a dull thump, and a second later, the side of the tent lit up. The heat came fast, way faster than I expected, and within seconds, the fire started spreading. That's what finally snapped me out of my haze. I woke Tiki up, and she immediately realized what was happening. We scrambled, no time to think. We started tossing our stuff out of the tent and onto the dirt. I'm not even sure we got everything. We sprinted out of the tent while the fire spread. Tiki grabbed one of our water jugs and dumped it on the fire, while I tried stomping out anything that had caught on fire. Eventually, we got it under control. Half the tent was completely ruined. I grabbed the flashlight and started scanning the area around the tent, looking for the person who had just tried to kill us, but there was no one. At least, no one I could see. Tiki started packing up our stuff, and I quickly followed suit. We started speed walking what we thought was the direction of the truck. There weren't any landmarks, and it was dark, so we were practically guessing. After a few minutes, it became clear we were turned around. At some point, maybe 10 minutes into walking, I heard it again. That same distant scream we'd heard the first 2 nights. Only this time, it didn't stop. It kept going, like an animal was in constant pain. And then another scream started from somewhere else, and then another one. They were all coming from behind us, but it was clear that there were multiple things out there. I didn't say anything. I just grabbed Tiki's arm and started moving faster. By some miracle, we actually found the truck. We practically threw all of our stuff into it, and I drove off as fast as I could. I couldn't go too fast, though. The road was rough, and without any light besides my high beams, it felt like every dip and bend could flip us. After what felt like forever, we finally hit a main road. I didn't stop speeding until I saw other cars again. Tiki was holding it together, but I could tell she wanted to cry, and I was doing a really bad job of consoling her. We did call the police to report everything that happened. All I can think about all of this is how, if I weren't such a light sleeper, my girlfriend and I could have been murdered that night in the middle of the desert. This is important context for what I'm about to tell you, so I'm going to start here. I've always been a little suspicious of my mom's past. Suspicious isn't exactly the right word, but I can't think of a better one. She was born in Mexico and spent her childhood there before moving to the States alone to pursue an undergrad degree. The rest is history. She found work, met my dad, and has lived in America ever since. I don't really know a lot about her life before America, and there's a part of me that thinks that's by design. She avoids talking about her past entirely and dismisses any questions about it with a joke or by changing the subject. Growing up, my dad always told me that it was because she had some childhood trauma that was better left undiscussed, and I believed that for the longest time. I mean, why wouldn't I? But as I grew older, I started getting more and more curious, and would often marvel at how skilled my mom was at dodging those kinds of questions at family gatherings and whatnot. Here's what I do know. She lived in a border town somewhere in northern Mexico along the Texas border. It doesn't have the best reputation, being a border town and all. The closest I've ever gotten to knowing anything about her parents is a joke that she told a few times when I was younger. She would laugh that her dad's side of the family were the politicians and her mom's side were the crooks, but she was never able to tell which was which. I never read into it as anything beyond a cynical political joke, but as I grew older, I started wondering whether there was more truth to that statement than I had originally thought. Her dad worked for the government in some capacity, and she never spoke about her mother, not once. The only other piece of information I have is a name. I'm not going to write it out, so I'm just going to call him R. One night when I was around 10 or 11, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I was walking past our living room, I heard my mom speaking in a quiet voice. I didn't understand Spanish, but she repeated R's name multiple times, the way someone talking about someone would, as opposed to someone speaking directly to someone. All the lights in there were off, so I couldn't actually see her, but I could hear her. Even though I knew it was just Mom, my young self was still a little scared of the dark, so I instinctively flipped the light switch on. She didn't scream or even react to the light. It was like she was anticipating that I'd be there. Instead, she immediately hung up the phone and glared at me with a look I had never seen from her. She told me to go back to bed, and I did. And that's it. That's basically all I know about my mother's past. A joke, her dad's very vague occupation, and the name R. What I'm about to tell you happened almost a year ago to date, and it's been on my mind a lot recently. I'm from Arizona, lived there my whole life. I was a year removed from graduating college, and I was driving through the desert on my way to meet up with one of my old college friends. It was a really long drive, I'm talking road trip hours, and I was tired of listening to music. I'm not a podcast guy, so I was low-key cycling through my contacts, calling up all my friends and whatever girls I happened to be talking to. Eventually, I decided to call my mom. We're both really into soccer, so we were talking about the upcoming Champions League fixtures and how exciting the matchups were. She's got some serious knowledge on the sport, so the two of us can talk soccer forever. Out of nowhere, I saw two pickup trucks blocking the road up ahead. It didn't look like a car accident, so I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I was worried that someone might need help or something, so I slowed down as I approached. My mom was still on the phone, but I hadn't let her know what was happening. I stopped my car and sat there, wondering if it would be a good idea to get out. Before I could do anything, 3 men sprang out from the 2 cars, all holding guns. I froze up and realized there was another car quickly approaching mine from behind. I was unarmed, so compliance was really my only choice at that point. One of the men tapped his gun on my door, motioning for me to get out. The other 2 stood a little further back. I put my hands up and slowly got out of my car. By that point, the car behind me had fully caught up and was parked a little ways away. The man barked a few commands in Spanish, but I didn't understand what they were saying. I consider my inability to speak Spanish one of my biggest failures in life, especially as a Mexican American. And in that moment, not being able to at least communicate with my assailants, I wanted to die. It didn't take a translator to know what they wanted me to do, though. Before I knew it, my phone, keys, wallet, and other personal belongings were in their possession, and it looked like I was going to be stranded in a barren desert with no viable escape. One of the men got into my truck, and that's when things took a turn. I realized I hadn't hung up the phone with my mom, and since my truck was still running, she was still on the line. I watched through my driver's side window as the man reached his finger toward the screen, as if to hang up, only to pull it back, like he had changed his mind. I kept watching, and it seemed like he was listening. I instantly connected the dots. My mom must have been speaking to him. Eventually, I saw his lips start moving and realized they were having a full-on conversation in there. I obviously couldn't hear anything because the windows and doors were closed, but I knew they were speaking Spanish. I swear on my life, I'm 90% sure he repeated R's name a few times, like my mom had said it and he was making sure he heard it correctly. At some point, the other guys must have realized what was going on, because they stopped guarding me and approached the car. The guy inside rolled the window down and stared at me as he spoke to the other 2 men. After he finished talking, all 3 of them turned and stared at me, as if sizing me up. The conversation didn't last long after that. They hung up the phone and walked back over to me. They handed me all my stuff back, including my car keys. The only thing they took was the cash in my wallet. One of the men looked at me, smiled, and in a thick accent said, "Tax," as he did it. I had never been more happy to lose all my cash in my life. As I drove away, all 3 cars, including the one that had been behind me, started speeding off into the desert, away from the road. My plan was to try memorizing their license plates, but none of the cars had any. I was still in shock. After a few minutes of driving, I called my mother back and demanded an explanation. She told me that she had simply threatened to call the police on them, as she was tracking my location and knew exactly where I was. I told her that was obviously BS, and insisted she tell me what they had really been talking about. She was adamant about her story, though, and told me most of the Spanish was just her pleading her case. Even though I didn't believe her story, there was nothing I could do but accept it. I asked her to call the police for me, and she said she would. Eventually, we ended the call, and I drove the rest of the way in complete silence. In all honesty, I blocked that experience out of my mind for as long as I could, but over time, I just couldn't anymore. I'm becoming more and more sure that my mom had some kind of tie to a Mexican gang or a cartel growing up. And even scarier, maybe that tie didn't end when she left Mexico. She knows I'm not stupid, so I don't know how much longer she expects to keep this charade up. I feel like I should just straight up ask her, but I'm really worried about what kind of tension that might create. Or worse, what kind of world I might be getting myself into should she tell me the truth. This happened when I was 18. I'm 22 now. I live in San Antonio, Texas. It was my senior year of high school, but this was when COVID just started blowing up, so everything began to shut down, including my school. Even though everyone was supposed to be staying home and being in quarantine, my friend group and I were going out more than ever. There wasn't much to do since all the non-essential businesses were closed. But one thing about me, I love urban exploring, or exploring haunted places. To this day, I still do. I'm not one to scare easily. I've had a couple experiences with the homeless, cults, even had a gun pointed at me, but nothing compared to how odd and creepy this one instance I came across while exploring was. Moving forward, Around this time, I started talking to a girl who I had a class with in high school. Her name was Clarissa. If it weren't for her matching my alibi of what happened this night, I'm sure none of my friends would have believed me. We were still kind of freshly dating, but I somehow convinced her to explore a wooded natural park at 3 a.m. here in San Antonio. The park is called O.P. Schnabel. It's relatively nice, safe, and very scenic during the day. But at night, it can be a dangerous place, and police usually roam the entrances to the area at night, keeping people away. In 2016, a 24-year-old woman named Lauren Bump was brutally murdered and stabbed over 20 times, and in 2021, a boy exploring the woods was shot. Clarissa and I get to the park around 3 a.m. It's super creepy and pitch black. The trees do a really good job at covering the moonlight. I don't like to have my flashlight on because then my eyes can't adjust to the darkness, and you can really only see what's lit up from the light. Plus, I wouldn't want someone to see my light from a far distance, so I like to keep them off while exploring. We were probably about 15 to 20 minutes in walking the main trail. I didn't plan to be in there for too long because it was kind of creepy and oddly quiet that night. I knew a trail that goes off the road that leads back to where my truck was parked. I told her we could take that trail, essentially making a full circle, instead of walking all the way back around. She agreed, and so we began walking through that off-road trail. We were probably only about 2 minutes into the off-road trail, when suddenly, out of nowhere, a flute began playing. Clarissa and I stopped dead in our tracks and looked at each other, just listening. Whoever was playing it, it was super in cadence and sounded like it was playing some sort of piece of music. However, there was no time for me to process that it may have sounded good. It was creepy as fuck. As I said before, I don't scare easily, but 15 seconds into the flute solo, Clarissa began trembling in fear and on the brink of crying. I was kind of just listening, but when Clarissa started praying to God to save her and forgive her for her sins, that's when I realized the severity of the situation. To be clear, it was super hard to pinpoint where the sound of the flute was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the previous main trail, which was parallel to where we were, with about maybe 30 to 50 yards of woods in between. But it was getting louder and closer, to the point where it sounded like the sound was right on top of us. Clarissa couldn't even focus because she was so scared, so I knew I had to man up and get us out of this situation. This is gonna sound corny, but I told her, "Don't worry, I'm not gonna let anything happen to you," and told her that we should run down the off-road trail to get away. So we did. We began to sprint. I believe the flute stopped playing, but it was hard to notice because I was more focused on getting the hell out of there. We only got about 30 feet, when out of nowhere, we heard the rustling of bushes and the snapping of leaves and twigs, before something big dashed across the trail right in front of us. Now this could have very well been a deer or some sort of bigger wildlife, but it was so strange because I could almost feel the size of whatever was in front of us. I don't know if it was from the wind or what. The only thing is, I never saw a silhouette or a shape of anything in front of us. Another strange thing is, I didn't hear it coming and I didn't hear it run away. I only heard the dash right when it was right in front of us. As soon as we felt and heard whatever dashed across the trail right in front of us, we obviously turned back around and bolted in the other direction until we got back to the original point where we heard the flute. And then, as if whoever was playing it was waiting for us to return, the flute started to play again, loud and right on top of us. This time it was almost chiming. It sounded like it belonged to some sort of Irish jig song or something, but the chiming was still in cadence. However, it was still impossible to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was just surrounding us. At this point, my fight or flight instincts kicked in because we were trapped. We had two options. Either go back into the off-road trail where we heard that terrifying dash right in front of us, or go back to the main trail where the flute and whatever psychopath was playing it was at. The off-road trail was definitely scarier because it was darker and surrounded by more dense forest, and at least the main trail was a cement path. Thus, I told Clarissa, who was still trembling in fear, let's start running down the main trail back to the truck. We ran back. Adrenaline was still pumping, so we cut the 20-minute walk into a 7 to 8 minute jog. And somewhere along the run, the flute noise must have stopped. Along the run back, there was a random porta potty, and I was scared to death because what if someone was on the other side or hiding inside of it, because it seemed to be somewhat parallel to where we were at earlier. Thankfully, I didn't see anyone, or signs of anyone ever having been there. In fact, my truck was the only vehicle in the area near the main entrance to the woods. We made it to the truck, and I sped far away from there. The next day, I told all my friends about it, and I looked all over the internet to see if anyone's ever come across anything like this. People claim to run into ghosts, cults, animals making terrifying noises, but a soft and rhythmic flute solo, I couldn't find anything on that. Or maybe I just didn't look hard enough. I tried to figure out all the possibilities. There are some houses that eventually led into a neighborhood on the far edge of the woods, but those houses are at least a couple miles away. And we were fairly deep into the woods, so there's no way the sound could have traveled that far, because I'm telling you, the flute was clear as day, and it was 3 a.m. Obviously, I never found out who was playing that flute, or what dashed right in front of us. I actually kind of got chills writing the story. The more I think about it, it actually seems more paranormal, rather than something scary on a tangible level. I don't know if it was a person, ghost, cult, or what. I'm really hoping someone might have a rational explanation. Either way, I never really went back to those woods at night. I still explored plenty of creepy places, but never really came across anything like that ever again. I'm a 20-year-old guy. I work at a medium-sized hospital in northwest Alabama as a pharmacy technician. I work an early night shift, 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. I'm also in charge of stocking the surgery rooms. I work for 7 days in a row, and then I have 7 days off. Working the 7 sucks, but the 7 off feels amazing. I work Thursday through Wednesday, and on my 6th night working, a Tuesday, I left a little early to go stay with my wife at her aunt's house, about 30 minutes away from our house. She was babysitting her little cousins while her aunt and uncle were on a trip. The house didn't have any curtains, so she felt uneasy for the few nights she was there. I didn't go with her at first because it was during my work week, and she told me there was really no point if I was going to get there around 5 a.m. and then go to sleep once the sun started to rise. But on her last night babysitting, she felt extremely anxious, so I told her I was coming over. She is stubborn, but she thanked me and felt so much better once I arrived. Working the night shift for the last 2 years has really taken a toll on me mentally, and I think I've started to develop some slight insomnia. I literally could not go to sleep after getting to my wife's aunt's house. This isn't anything new, but I had never stayed up for more than about 28 hours before. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't sleep because we had a really big day ahead of us. We had to drop her little cousins off at school, our friend was having a gender reveal party, we had to go shopping because we had no groceries at home since she had been away for the last 3 days, and I had to be at work at 6 p.m. I ended up falling asleep in the car for a little less than 10 minutes. I was really feeling that wave of sleepiness come over me, but I ended up getting a huge Red Bull and another energy drink once I got to work. I had my wife drive me to work and pick me up since my brakes needed to be changed and I wasn't driving my car, and also because neither of us trusted myself to drive her car on over 24 hours of no sleep. It was Wednesday night now, and I had been awake since about 2 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. My shift started out fine. If I could stay busy, that tired feeling wouldn't really get to me. I put in my earbuds and was listening to music as I was stocking the surgery rooms with their meds. It was a weeknight, so there were still some late surgeries finishing up, and housekeeping was cleaning up some operating rooms that had been used. It's not uncommon for surgery personnel to come into the room I was in and grab something that the room they were using may be out of, so I usually turn around and at least smile, and they smile back. I was in my own little world, stocking the Omnicell machine with meds and listening to music, when I heard the door behind me open. There was that distinct high-pitched squeal when a door needs its hinges to be oiled. It made the loud crash that heavy wooden doors make when they shut, so I turned around to see who it was like always, except there was no one there. I didn't really get worried about it. Maybe they opened the door and saw I was in there and just decided to go to another room, so I continued on. As I pushed my cart to the next room, the light in this room was off. I opened the door, and I swear, I saw someone hunched over by the Omnicell machine, digging through the sharps bin. If you don't know what that is, it's a bin where you dispose of needles and vials after use instead of just putting them in a normal garbage can. Someone had already been caught doing this before in search of morphine and consequently was fired. I turned on the light and was going to ask what they were doing, but when I turned the light on, there was no one there. Okay, now I was starting to get a little creeped out. I didn't know the time frame of when you could start hallucinating after not sleeping for over 24 hours, so I just told myself I was probably seeing things and needed to just calm down. I finished up stocking surgery with no other occurrences and headed back to the pharmacy. At 2 a.m. every night, we have to deliver patient-specific medications to the nurses' station. I'm going to use the 5th floor as an example of how the floors are laid out, but each floor number corresponds with which floor they were on. There are 3 elevators in the middle of the floor. If you go left when getting off the elevator, there's the 5100 and 5200 side, and if you go to the right, there's the 5400 and 5500 side. There are 2 wings on each side, so there are patient rooms numbered 5105 to 5115, and the other wing has rooms 5201 to 5215. Each floor is laid out the exact same way, so each wing has 15 rooms on each side. To shorten the floor names though, I'm going to refer to them as 51, 52, and 54, 55. Recently, the 5th floor, specifically the 54-55 side, had been undergoing some remodeling, so our overflow floor, the 3rd floor, was where they put the patients who were on the 54-55 side of the 5th floor while they remodeled. The 54-55 side was empty because there weren't that many people in the hospital that night. I made my way up the hospital, delivering meds to the nurses' station floor by floor, until I got to the 5th floor. I went to the 51-52 side, delivered the meds, and decided to go check out the progress of the 54-55 side. As I went over there, I just got creeped out. There were no nurses, no patients, just the long, empty hallways. The surgery rooms are already empty and desolate most nights, so I'm used to walking around down there no problem. But seeing empty patient rooms just creeped me out. I walked slowly down the 55 side. I heard a noise that sounded like one of the hospital beds rattling. As I passed 5512, I quickly found out what the noise was. As I looked into the rooms, I saw an old man violently shaking as if he was having a seizure. Blood was running down his eyes, nose, and out of his mouth. He was making this gargling, groaning sound, almost like the sounds the zombies in The Walking Dead make. A monitor was frantically beeping like it does when a patient is coding. My heart dropped when I saw this, and I took a quick step behind the doorframe. I immediately stepped back into the room as I realized this man was in desperate need of medical attention. But when I looked back in there was no man. This bed was clean and made. The monitor was off, and there were no signs that anyone had even been in that room for at least a whole day. I thought at that point I was for sure hallucinating. I quickly made my way back over to the elevators, and I made my way back down to the 1st floor where the pharmacy is. As the elevator doors opened, an old man in a security shirt and hospital badge got on the elevator. He patted my shoulder as he walked past me. It was that same man I had seen moments before having a seizure and making those zombie-like noises. He smiled at me as the doors closed, and I watched the numbers on the elevator go all the way up to the 5th floor. I didn't push the button for the elevator to come back down, but the same elevator came back down to the 1st floor and opened. There was no one on the elevator. I ran back to the pharmacy and sat in a chair for the rest of my shift until my wife came and picked me up. As I was waiting, I googled when hallucinations start when you haven't slept. It said between 30 and 48 hours, and I was on hour 38 of no sleep, so it made sense. The pharmacy is located directly under the 54-55 side, so when I walk in, I can see the window at the end of the hospital wing on the 24, 34, 44, and 54 side. Sometimes as I wait on the elevator on that side to go back down to the pharmacy, I look out the window. As I was walking out to my wife's car, I looked back up at the 5th floor window and saw the same old man looking at me through the window. I got chills as I got into my wife's car. I didn't say anything about what I saw that night. I'm not sure why I would have hallucinated that specific man, as I've never seen him before, and even if I have, he has no significance in my life whatsoever. I'm still not sure though, if that was even a hallucination, or if what I saw that night was real. It certainly felt real. I went to sleep immediately after getting home. I've not seen that man again, but this was just under 2 weeks ago. I live with my boyfriend in his house that he owns. It's a modest house in a good neighborhood. Violent crime here is typically low. I say it's a modest house because compared to the other houses in the neighborhood, it's on the smaller side. But having a smaller house in this neighborhood is still very desirable because it allows us to still live in a nice town without owning a multi-million-dollar home. It's a single-floor, 3-bed and 2-bathroom house with a basement. We're on a very quiet block with a lot of privacy. The way the street curves provides this optimal privacy, as when we step outside of the house, there's not a single neighboring house directly facing us. There are 8 houses total on our block. Further down the block is a small wooded area. My boyfriend Mika was away one weekend in Vegas for a bachelor party last October. I was alone from Thursday to Monday. Friday after work, I had some of my girls over for a wine night. At some point while we were in the living room watching scary movies, the doorbell rang. We all went quiet and looked at one another with the same faces. The doorbell ringing late at night while watching a scary movie almost felt not real. I went to go sneakily see if I could see who was outside on the porch, but I couldn't get a view from the window. There is a tiny glass panel at the top of the door, so I peeked through it. There were like 4 cars in the driveway. They had to know people were home, but I didn't see anyone on the porch. I went back to my friends, and while we all agreed that was weird, we accepted that it was just a very unfortunately timed ding-dong ditch. After everyone left, it was late enough for me to go to bed and fall asleep right away. But I was awoken that night, not even an hour later, to the doorbell ringing twice. I looked at my phone and it was like 1 a.m. No one belongs outside your door at this hour. I immediately called Mika, and he picked up, sounding really drunk in a loud bar. He had to go to a bathroom to be able to hear me. Once he heard me, he told me to just stay in the bedroom and not open the door to anyone. He never once suggested calling the police, so I refrained from doing that for now. We ended our call, and I tried to just stay calm and go back to sleep. Just as my heart rate started to slow and I started to calm down, I heard something from outside. Some kind of clicking sounds, until there was a knock at my window. And a male's voice said,
"Hey, anyone home? I need some help out here."
I thanked the Lord the blinds were closed. I couldn't see who was out there, and they couldn't see me. Instead of leaving, he knocked again on the window. He said,
"I know you're home."
This was what prompted me to call the police. I never heard the man outside walk away from the window. For all I knew, he was still standing outside of it. So I whispered the entire time while on the phone, reporting someone trying to break into my house. Call me dramatic or an embellisher, but I was scared and I wanted the police here ASAP. Within 5 to 10 minutes, the doorbell rang again, followed by loud knocks. I went out and approached the front door and asked who it is. A male's voice said it's the police. It was a different voice from the other guy. I looked through the glass and confirmed it was a couple police officers. I opened the door for them, and right off the bat, the taller officer in front walked right into my house without my even inviting him in. He said they were responding to my report of a disturbance, and I said there's a man lurking around the house ringing the bell and knocking on my window. I don't want to make a big part of my recounting this story about this particular police officer, but he was the rudest man I'd ever met. I felt like he was on a power trip. He was demeaning towards me, telling me to shush and talking over me while I was trying to explain. He also didn't seem to take my claims very seriously. His partner didn't say a word, he just stood in the back. The taller one asked me details that I'd already made clear I wouldn't have, such as what the man looked like, when I clearly stated that I hadn't seen him. And the officer actually said to me, "Well, you're the one who called us, ma'am. If you don't want our help, we can leave." I was taken aback completely. I'd never called the police before, and I never expected such a lack of professionalism. I apologized and said I'm just scared. It was around this time that the 2 officers walked around the house with their flashlights. They went full circle and then came back, but honestly, they didn't really check very thoroughly. I watched them through the windows. They came back to the door and told me there's nothing they can do if I don't have any cameras or proof of the man trying to commit any wrongdoing. The 2 cops then left. I didn't feel any better at all, besides the fact that maybe whoever that man was saw I called the police. I went back to bed, and thankfully the next time I woke up was to sunlight creeping in through the closed blinds. It was around 10 a.m. It was Saturday, and that night my friend was having a Halloween party that I was going to help set up for. During the day I did a little grocery shopping, and while I was at it picked up some things for the party. My costume was Velma from Scooby-Doo, and my friend throwing the party was Daphne. I got to her house around 6 p.m. The party started at 9, and it really picked up around 10:30. I was there pretty late. I probably left her house a little after 1 a.m. I was good to drive, as I didn't really drink much besides a few beers. When I got home, I immediately noticed a cool draft in the house. After setting my things down on the dining room table, I noticed a window open. I went to shut it, trying to remember why I would have opened it. I went to brush my teeth, but then when I came out from the bathroom, I noticed the basement door was wide open. I froze. This was when I started hearing this faint but consistent clicking sound. As I got closer to the basement stairs, I realized it was coming from down there. And then I got to the top of the stairs, and I looked down to the pitch black basement, and the clicking suddenly stopped. A voice from below suddenly said, "You're finally home." With that, I slammed the basement door shut and took my phone with me outside. I banged on the neighbor's door until he answered, and I chose to call the police in the safety of my neighbor's house. It was unfortunately the same 2 officers who returned to my house. My neighbor accompanied me as I went to speak with them this time, and I think that may have had some kind of impact on that taller cop's attitude. He wasn't as rude this time. He and his partner checked the house while my neighbor and I stood in the living room. Eventually, after their initial search, I showed them some of the spots I'd imagined someone could be hiding. I basically tore the entire house upside down, while also on the phone with my drunk boyfriend. When I was sure that no one was here anymore, I packed a bag to go stay with my sister until Mika came back. This time I locked every window before leaving. The main takeaway lesson from my story is if you have windows that open wide enough for someone to crawl through, make sure they're always locked when they're closed. We still live in this house today, but for a few months, I refused to be alone in the house for extended periods. I still have PTSD from this, and sometimes I have nightmares in which I think I'm hearing knocks at the window, and then I wake up. My name is Mike, and this happened last year when my fiancé and I bought our first starter home together. We're an Asian couple, which is relevant to the story. It was a small 2-story house in a basic suburban town in Georgia. There was nothing special about it, but to us it was supposed to be special. It was a typical quiet street, decent backyard, cheap fence, and regular-looking houses lined up next to each other. We felt lucky to even buy a house at our age, so it was a very exciting point in our lives that was quite literally robbed from us, which you'll soon hear why. The first few days were normal. We unpacked, met a few neighbors, and tried to settle in. The neighbor on our right side was a friendly older couple. The neighbor across the street waved and came across to say hi when he saw us. But the house on our left side was different. We didn't see anyone come out of it for the first few days. The curtains were always shut. The house looked clean and normal, don't get me wrong, but it was always kind of dark inside, like no one was home even though there was a car in the driveway. The only time we noticed anything was when we saw someone standing inside their front window one afternoon. My fiancée and I were carrying groceries in from the car when she whispered something to me about it. I looked over and saw a man standing behind the curtain, only half visible but totally watching us. He didn't wave. As soon as he saw us glance at him, he walked away from the window. It was weird, but we didn't think too much about it. Some people are just quiet or awkward. Over the next week, we started noticing him more often. Not outside, but inside his house. I would catch him standing in his living room window sometimes when I left for work. My fiancée told me she saw him in the upstairs window once when she was getting the mail. Every time we noticed him, he seemed to be watching us, but never in a way where he stayed long. The second we looked back, he was gone. One night, something happened that made both of us uneasy in a way we couldn't ignore. Around midnight, I was getting ready for bed when I walked past our upstairs window. Our bedroom window faced directly toward his house. When I looked, out of habit, I saw him in his upstairs window. This time he wasn't halfway hidden or standing behind a curtain. He was fully visible. He stood straight up with his face turned toward our bedroom window. I froze for a second because I wasn't sure if I was actually seeing it right, but the second he realized I saw him, he stepped back away from the window. I remember saying to my fiancée with a laugh, "Oh great, our neighbor's a creep." The next morning, the man came to our door. It was the first time we saw him outside. He knocked politely and introduced himself as Gordon. He apologized for looking like he was spying the night before. He told me he had been putting something on his window ledge and didn't mean to look into our room. He smiled the whole time, and it was a welcoming enough smile to give me a bit of relief. I'm not saying I loved the guy instantly. There was definitely something slightly off about him, but the apology was appreciated. I didn't want to be rude, so I told him it was fine. When I went back inside, I told my fiancé he seemed somewhat nice, but a little weird. We decided to forget about it. A week later, something else happened that we couldn't ignore. In the middle of the night, my fiancée shook me awake, telling me she heard someone in the yard. I was half asleep, but I got up to check the window. Gotta do what you gotta do as the man of the house. When I looked outside, I saw someone walking in our yard. Unless it was fucking Bigfoot, it was definitely a person. A full-grown man walking around like he was looking for something. My first reaction was to shout out, "Hey," even though I knew that wasn't the smartest thing to do. As soon as I yelled, the person walked fast toward the gate and slammed it shut behind him. Since we didn't have anything in the backyard yet besides some gardening tools, I didn't think someone was trying to steal anything, and I didn't bother to check the backyard. I did check the front windows though, and didn't see anyone. I didn't go outside because I didn't feel safe, and eventually, my fiancée and I went back to sleep, even though we felt uneasy. A few nights after that, the same thing happened again. My fiancée woke me up, telling me she heard rustling outside. This time we both heard it clearly. It sounded like someone was shimmying something. I can't say what, but best description I could give was some kind of lock. I went to the window again, and sure enough, I saw someone in the backyard. I felt my whole body tense up this time. I yelled that I was calling the cops. The person walked out of the yard and again slammed the gate the same way, but this time I saw enough of the man's face and posture to know it looked exactly like Gordon. I yelled Gordon, but he didn't respond. He just walked away like nothing happened. This time I went outside. I checked the yard, then the sides of the house. I took a deep breath and told myself I have to confront this now. I walked over to Gordon's house and knocked. He answered within seconds, which told me he was awake the whole time. He smiled like he always did, and started laughing while telling me that it was him in the yard. He said he was chasing away kids who always jumped the fences in the neighborhood, and he caught them jumping from his backyard into our backyard. He said it happens all the time and told me I'd get used to it. He kept smiling the whole time, but something about the smile didn't feel normal. It felt like something was behind it. I saw hate in his eyes, I swear. I didn't argue with him. I just told him I understood and went back home. But deep down, I didn't believe a word he said. The next day, he came over again and invited us to come to his house for Chinese food the next night, which would be a Friday. We felt like saying yes would at least clear the awkwardness between us, and we could just be cordial neighbors. We went to his house around 7 p.m. that Friday. The second we walked in, the atmosphere felt uncomfortable. Gordon seemed relatively intoxicated and got only more drunk as he kept sipping more wine. He said he ordered a bunch of Chinese food and made a little weird comment like, "I know you guys love Chinese food," then laughed. He made little passive-aggressive comments here and there. Eventually the food arrived and he paid, and we offered to help him set up the table, but he almost yelled when he said no. The whole dinner felt tense. Then, as he finished more and more wine, he started acting more differently. He started making rude comments that were less passive and more direct. He said things that made it pretty clear he didn't like that an Asian couple moved into the neighborhood. At first we tried ignoring it, hoping it would stop, but then he got louder and more angry. I mean it, he actually started getting himself angry as he talked about how this town had a history of being white. He started saying things that made both of us feel unsafe, honestly. Then he told us that it was in fact him going into our backyard those nights. He didn't deny it or try to hide it. The climax of the night was when he yelled at us that we were not welcome there and that the neighborhood wasn't for people like us. At that point, we didn't say anything. We just stood up and left. We walked back to our house as fast as we could. We didn't even talk about it until we were inside with the doors locked. We didn't know what to do except go to the other neighbors. So we walked door to door, asking them about Gordon. Some of them were shocked when we told them what happened. Others weren't surprised at all. A few people told us Gordon was a drunk whose wife left him years ago. It didn't make us feel any better because we were living next to him now. We tried to avoid him after that. We didn't look at his house, we didn't go outside unless we had to. But how long could you avoid your next door neighbor? Every night felt tense, like he could be watching us or trespassing again. Then, one night, a brick was thrown through our downstairs window. It shattered glass all over the living room. We both jumped out of bed when we heard it. When I ran downstairs, the brick was lying on the floor. No note attached or anything, just a brick. We knew it was Gordon. There was no one else it could have been, but we had no proof. We filed a police report. The police came to talk to him, but he denied everything. He acted confused and told them he had nothing to do with it. The police couldn't do anything except document the incident. We talked about putting up cameras and staying to fight it out, but honestly, we were too scared, and this was mentally exhausting already. We both felt like something worse would happen if we stayed. Not even 2 months after moving in, we started packing again. We couldn't live next to someone who hated us and had already gone into our yard at night and then thrown a brick at our house. Before we left, we filed another report explaining everything. The police said they would keep an eye on the situation, but we didn't feel protected. We moved out of that house and out of that neighborhood as fast as we could. We left behind the home we thought would be our first chapter in life together. I still think if we stayed there, you'd have eventually heard of my fiancée and I on the news having been murdered by this man. I wish it wasn't illegal to dox people. Boy, would I love to drop his address in this story. All we can do now is move on and upward from here. This story happened a couple of years ago, around late 2021. My name is Noah, and me and my fiancée Gabby, who is now my wife, had moved into a new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a nice 2-story house, perfect for our future family. The neighbors seemed friendly and welcoming as well. Most notably, the neighbors that lived to the right of us seemed the friendliest. It was a couple in their late 30s, but I wasn't really sure. The husband's name was Daniel, and his wife was named Veronica. They were very friendly and seemed like sweet people. They even baked us a red velvet cake as a little welcoming gift. The cake was really good, and we couldn't thank them enough for it. The first couple of weeks were good in the new neighborhood. It was quiet and peaceful, until we started noticing strange things with our neighbors, Daniel and Veronica. One night, around 11 p.m., I heard shouting coming from outside. I looked out my bedroom window and realized it was coming from their house, like they were arguing. I couldn't see them because the angle of the houses blocked my view. Eventually, I saw Veronica storm out to her car and leave. After that, it was quiet again. I told Gabby about it, and we just chalked it up to them getting into an argument and Veronica leaving to cool off. I was kind of concerned because they seemed like such sweet people, not the type to have heated arguments. But every couple has disagreements. We didn't think too much of it. Later on that same week, Gabby and I were coming back home. When we got out of the car, we heard yelling coming from inside their house again. They had their main door open, but the storm door was closed, so we could hear them arguing clearly. Again, it wasn't our business, so we ignored it. Then one day, I noticed Veronica's car wasn't there for a few days, but I assumed maybe she was on vacation. Daniel was still there because his car stayed parked, and I would see him go out once in a while. But then it became a week, then 2 weeks, and Veronica's car was still gone. My wife noticed too and thought maybe they got divorced or something, which would make sense due to their constant arguing. But the way she left was so sudden. One day her car was there, the next it was gone. And Daniel was acting weird. Every time we saw him, he would try to avoid us. He wouldn't wave like neighbors usually do, and the rare times I talked to him, he would talk fast and try to end the conversation as soon as possible, like he was nervous. Something was definitely up with him. After 3 weeks of Veronica being gone, I decided to go over and ask Daniel how things were. My fiancé argued against it, saying it wasn't our business and to leave it alone. But curiosity got the best of me, and I knew she was curious too, so I rang his doorbell. I knew he was home because his car was there. It took him almost 3 minutes to answer, and when he did, he looked off. He was sweating like he just ran a marathon, and he had this weird forced smile like he was hiding something. I asked him about Veronica and why I haven't seen her or her car in a while. He hesitated and said, she just went to go stay with her mom for a while out of state because she's very sick and she's looking after her. I felt like that was a lie, but I didn't question it. I might have believed him if he wasn't acting so strange. I then asked why he was sweating so much, and he said he was doing workouts upstairs. He was speaking really fast, like he was rushed or nervous, but then something happened that made my heart drop. I heard a voice scream from somewhere inside the house. I wasn't exactly sure where, but I was almost positive it was a woman's voice yelling for help. I asked what that was, and Daniel quickly said, I'm playing a movie upstairs and forgot to pause it. That made no sense since he had just said he was working out upstairs. I just said okay and told him I would catch him later. I went back home and told Gabby everything. She was just as concerned as me and told me to call the cops. I did, and I requested to stay anonymous, even though Daniel would probably know it was me. I told the dispatcher that I heard something in my neighbor's house and wanted them to do a welfare check. Eventually, an officer pulled up. About 10 minutes later, I heard sirens and saw 5 police cars and an ambulance. Me and Gabby rushed outside. Officers were everywhere. Daniel was being taken away in handcuffs while Veronica was being rushed to the ambulance on a stretcher. We later found out Daniel and Veronica had been in an abusive relationship and things had escalated badly. Daniel kept her locked in the basement for weeks. I didn't even know they had a basement. Down there, he would assault her, rape her, abuse her, and do horrible things. He even sold her car to make it look like she wasn't home. When I heard that scream while talking to him, it turned out he stabbed her 5 times because she had made noise when he told her to be quiet while he answered the door. That explained why he was acting so strange. Unfortunately, Veronica didn't survive and passed a couple hours later. As Daniel was being escorted into a police car, he said, "I know it was you who snitched on me, and you'll regret this." I wanted to laugh it off if the situation wasn't so messed up, knowing he would be behind bars for a long time. It's crazy how you never know who people truly are behind closed doors. Daniel seemed like a friendly, normal guy, and so did Veronica. They seemed like a great couple, but obviously they had serious issues hidden underneath. Fast forward a couple nights after the incident, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was dark, and I saw the silhouette of a person. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that it was Daniel. My heart dropped. He said, "I told you you would regret this." He was holding a knife. I tried talking him down, telling him to calm down and just talk, but he didn't respond. I pressed myself against the headboard. Then, out of nowhere, he lunged at me. I screamed, and then I woke up for real. I was breathing heavily, and Gabby was beside me. She asked what was wrong, and I said it was just a bad dream. She went back to sleep, but I couldn't. The fact that I dreamed about my neighbor who murdered his wife breaking into my house to kill me chills me to this day. Most dreams fade, but this one stayed vivid, and the words he said in the dream were the exact same ones he said while being taken away in cuffs. I never told my wife about this dream. I don't know why. I guess because she might think I'm crazy or it would just stress her out. Eventually, after we got married, we moved to another part of town. It's a nice, quiet neighborhood and a great house, but the whole event traumatized us. Knowing we lived next to a murderer still haunts us. My name is Devin, and this happened 2 years ago when I was 24 and living in a duplex in Queens, New York. It was a small, old house that looked divided right down the middle. I rented the left side, and some man rented the right side. I never met him. I never even saw him. The landlord said he kept to himself and worked nights, so it didn't concern me. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and the wall of my bedroom was the same wall as the neighbor's bedroom. If I pressed my ear up to the wall, I could hear faint movements on the other side sometimes, but that's to be expected in New York City. The first week that I lived there, nothing strange happened.
I worked long hours, came home tired, ate something simple, and went straight to bed. I was just happy to have my own place. And then one night, things began. I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard what sounded like a man talking, but it didn't sound like a normal man's voice. It was high-pitched, like someone trying to talk in a fake voice. It was faint, and it was being spoken from the other room, but the wall was so thin that it felt like the person was standing right next to me. I couldn't understand what he was saying. It was just this weird, high voice mumbling. I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was on the phone, or maybe he was watching something on TV. Eventually, the mumbling stopped and I fell asleep. A few nights later, though, the mumbling came back. But this time it was louder, and this time it was definitely a man talking. I pressed my ear lightly to the wall and listened. It didn't sound like he was on the phone. It sounded like he was talking to himself. I didn't know whether to laugh or be slightly creeped out. To block the noise out, I put the blanket over my head. I had work early the next morning and I needed sleep. I think that was the first night I realized I did not like living there alone. 2 weeks after that, the knocks started. I was lying in bed again, half asleep, when I heard 2 taps on the wall right next to my head. It was so close that I flinched like someone was touching me. I sat up and waited a few moments in silence. And then, there were 2 more identical taps on the wall from the other side. I knew for sure that it was not a house settling noise that could just easily be explained away. I rolled away from the wall and sat there shaking. I kept waiting to hear something else, but it went quiet. I wanted to knock back, but I realized that acknowledging it would likely make it worse. The next morning, I told myself it was not a big deal and that I was overreacting. Over the next week, the knocks continued. Sometimes soft, sometimes harder, always at night, and always when I was trying to sleep. One night it went on for so long that I put in headphones and turned on a loud fan. I remember lying awake thinking about how thin the wall was, how close his room was, how close he was. He could literally be lying just 2 feet away from me. It scared me more every night. But still, the knocks could have just been him sitting against the wall and accidentally banging or tapping the wall with something. But then came the night that everything changed. I'll never forget it. I was lying in bed on my side, facing the wall. My eyes were closed, but I was not asleep yet. The room was dark, except for my street lamp shining through the blinds. I heard the knocks again. 3 slow ones. I kept my eyes closed and tried not to react. Then I heard that same high-pitched man's voice come through the wall. It was muffled, but not that muffled. I could hear each word clear enough. He said,
What are you doing in there?
My lungs locked up. I sat straight up in bed, shaking so hard I felt my teeth chattering. This was no longer just potential accidental taps on the wall. He was now acknowledging me directly. He said it straight through the wall. I could just tell he said it like he knew I was right next to him. I grabbed my phone and called my boyfriend. I whispered to him that I was scared out of my mind and told him exactly what happened. He told me he was coming over right away and he would stay the night with me. I stayed sitting up with the lights on until he arrived. The rest of the night, nothing happened. It was almost worse that way. It made me feel crazy, like the neighbor knew my boyfriend was there. For a few days, things were quiet. I started thinking maybe it was just some weird coincidence that the neighbor was doing something and I misheard. But then a few nights later, something happened that made me leave the house running. I still have bad dreams about it. I was asleep this time, fully asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I woke up fast. Something snapped me awake. I sat up slightly, and then it started. The knocks on the wall, like someone drumming their fingers right beside my head. I screamed back without thinking. I shouted for whoever it was to leave me alone. I was shaking and breathing hard. I think mustering up the courage to finally yell back spiked my adrenaline. I don't know exactly what I expected next, but I will tell you, what did happen next I never expected in a million years. There was a voice. It came from inside my room. A voice in the dark said, "Go to sleep." It was not the voice from the wall. It was deeper and closer, right there in my room. I launched off my bed screaming. For some reason, the brief moments of my running through the hallway and down the stairs was a blur, because I really just remember getting outside and running into the street screaming for help over and over. I must have looked insane. I ran barefoot onto the sidewalk. I kept looking behind me, expecting someone to be chasing me. I didn't stop screaming until a man 2 houses down came outside and stared at me like he didn't know what to do. I begged him to let me use his phone to call my boyfriend, but he said by the sound of it I needed to call the police. So I called the police instead. I waited by that man's sidewalk shaking and crying until the police arrived. When they showed up, I told them everything that happened. They asked me if I was sure that someone was in the house, and I said yes, 100% yes. They drove me back to my duplex, and 2 officers went inside. My front door was still wide open like I left it. They said there were no signs of forced entry. They asked me if I remembered unlocking the door as I ran out. I had no memory of touching the lock. I told them I didn't think I unlocked it, but I was so panicked that maybe I did. I couldn't be sure. They checked every room, every closet, under the bed, everywhere. No one was in the house. They knocked on the neighbor's door too, but he wouldn't open up. It looked like he wasn't home at all. Eventually my boyfriend showed up and took me back to his place. I was still shaking hours later. I don't remember sleeping again the rest of the night. In the morning, I called my landlord and told him everything. I told him I needed to know who the neighbor was and if he had any history of problems or strange behavior. I also told him I wanted to break the lease immediately. At first, he pushed back. He said he needed notice and paperwork. I told him I would not step foot in that duplex alone again, and he needed to help me. It took a whole day of phone calls before he said he would let me break the lease. My boyfriend came with me every single time I went back to the duplex to move my stuff. I refused to go alone. During those days, we tried knocking on the neighbor's door multiple times, but he never answered. It was like no one lived there. But there were signs that someone did, like packages at the door and a car in the driveway, but no human response. I ended up moving back in with my parents for a while until I found a new place. I still don't know if that neighbor was actually in my room that night, or if someone got in without the police noticing, or if it was just all in my head from the stress. But that one's the least likely explanation because it's pretty clear what's real and what's in your head. My landlord told me later that the neighboring tenant eventually moved out too without saying a word. I don't know what really happened in that duplex.
Before we get into today's stories, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, ZocDoc. A lot of the stories I cover start with something small, like a feeling you brush off, or a detail you tell yourself isn't important. And honestly, that's not too different from how a lot of us treat our own health, like a weird pain or just the mental stress of knowing you probably should see a doctor, but putting it off anyway. I caught myself doing the same thing, telling myself I'd deal with it tomorrow. That's when I used ZocDoc, and it actually made the whole process painless. ZocDoc is a free website that lets you search for in-network doctors, compare them by specialty, see real appointment availability, and book instantly. In many cases, you can get in within just a couple of days. You can read verified patient reviews, check out doctor profiles, and choose someone you're genuinely comfortable with no awkward phone calls. What I loved was being able to find a doctor who had next-day availability and reviews that specifically mentioned listening and taking patients seriously. That matters because walking into an appointment already feels stressful enough. So if you've been avoiding a doctor's visit or just want an easier way to find someone you actually trust, head over to ZocDoc.com/Mr. Nightmare and see what's available in your area. It only takes a few clicks. I went camping alone last winter with my dog Roscoe, and it's something I'll never do again. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to get away from people. I loaded my truck with my gear and drove up a long, narrow trail that cut deep into a state forest. The road was barely maintained, covered in packed snow and ice, and there were no other cars anywhere. After driving for almost an hour, I parked at a small pull-off that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. From there, I hiked another 20 minutes with my pack and Roscoe until I reached a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The snow was deep and untouched. There were no footprints or signs of anyone else being around recently. That was what I wanted.
I set my pack down, cleared a spot for a tent, and let Roscoe wander around while I worked. He stayed close, sniffing the snow in the trees and just jumping around playing. I pitched the tent, staked it down hard because the ground was frozen, and laid out my sleeping pad and winter-rated sleeping bag inside. I knew it was going to be a cold night, well below freezing, so I layered properly. Thermal base layers, thick socks, a fleece, and a heavy jacket stayed on even after camp was set. Once the tent was ready, I gathered dead wood and built a small fire pit. I started a fire and let it burn down until I had a steady flame. I cooked dinner over it, just a simple meal, and sat on a log eating while Roscoe lay near the fire. The woods were quiet in that deep winter way where sound feels almost non-existent. I learned a long time ago from my dad that snow actually absorbs sound. After I ate, Roscoe suddenly stood up and started barking toward the trees. It didn't concern me at first. Deer were everywhere out there, and he had barked at them before. I told him to relax, and he did after a minute, sitting back down. I checked the time and decided I'd stay up a bit longer by the fire before turning in. I always carried a handgun when camping in remote places, and it was holstered at my side like it always was. I felt fine at that point. About 20 minutes later, Roscoe started barking again, louder this time. Then I heard it too, footsteps moving through the snow somewhere out in the woods. I stood up and listened. The steps stopped, then started again. Roscoe went from barking to growling, then suddenly went silent. He stood staring straight ahead toward the trees. That was when I felt uneasy. I followed his gaze and saw a shape at the edge of the tree line. Someone was standing there, half hidden in the darkness, just barely lit by the fire. I called out, saying that he scared me, and telling Roscoe it was okay. The figure didn't move at first. Then he stepped forward slightly, enough for me to see that it was a man. He asked what I was doing out there, that deep in the woods. His tone wasn't friendly. I told him I was just getting out into nature with my dog. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there watching me. I could feel the situation turning wrong. I told him calmly that I was armed. The man slightly laughed and said something about me threatening him instead of inviting him to join me, and asked where my hospitality was. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness, his footsteps fading into the woods. I stood there for a long time after that, staring at the trees. Roscoe stayed close to me. I didn't like any of it, but eventually I told myself he was gone. I put out the fire carefully, throwing snow on it and stirring the ashes until there was nothing left that could glow. I didn't want light drawing attention. I crawled into my tent and sealed it up. Inside, I did everything I could to stay warm. I laid my sleeping pad down to keep the cold ground from draining heat from my body. I stayed fully dressed, pulled on a knit hat, and cinched my sleeping bag tight around my shoulders. I kept a hand warmer near my core and another near my feet. Roscoe curled up next to me, his body heat helping more than anything. I lay there listening to the woods, or rather, the extreme silence. After a while, Roscoe started growling again. Then I heard what he was growling at. Footsteps in the snow. They stopped, and Roscoe quieted, but his ears were still perked up. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time, and slower than before. They came right up to the tent and stopped. Roscoe began howling loudly. I whispered for him to stop, terrified of drawing attention. When he did stop, he went back to growling. Whoever it was just stood outside the tent. I could hear subtle movement, like the shift of weight in the snow. I had my gun in my hand now, but I didn't want to make threats. I didn't want to be forced to follow through with the threats. I have never actually shot anyone, and I don't think I have it in me to kill someone even in self-defense. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cocked the gun and said clearly that I had a gun and that whoever was there needed to leave now. But realistically, who else could it have been besides that creepy guy from before? There was silence for a few seconds. Then I heard footsteps again, moving away from the tent. Slowly at first, then faster before disappearing into the woods. I didn't unzip the tent to look out. I stayed frozen for hours. Roscoe stayed alert the entire time, which was the only reason I even felt remotely comfortable eventually nodding off. I certainly wouldn't have if I were alone. I barely slept, drifting off only in short bursts. When the sky finally began to lighten, I packed up as fast as I could at the crack of dawn. We hiked back to my truck and drove away. I never went back to that part of the woods again, and I never will. Creeps like that guy really make life scary sometimes, and remind you that you can never really let your guard down. July 4th weekend in 2025. I drove from Melbourne, Florida to Charleston, South Carolina to visit a good friend named Mark I hadn't seen in years. He was there on an internship for his law program and staying in a house in the city. I was visiting for the weekend and spending the night downstairs on a couch by some windows. After a smooth drive, I arrived in Charleston, and we played some pickleball before nightfall. When the night settled in, I went back downstairs to the couch by the windows that faced another apartment building and a small labyrinth of alleyways with an abandoned house across the street. The next day, after playing more pickleball in the morning and hanging out, we went to the main Charleston market. We walked through it and eventually came out near the docks by the water. That's when we saw him. A man in a wedding suit was shambling down the road near the water. He wore a crisp bow tie and clean dress shoes, and his suit looked freshly pressed. He had long black curly hair and a tan complexion. The market behind us was loud and busy, yet this man moved alone across the street with a slow, detached movement. He didn't notice us and seemed to be in his own world. If we crossed the street, we would have walked straight into him. Instinctively, I wanted to avoid him. I grabbed Mark by the arm and told him we were not crossing. We walked to the right, deeper into the city, and picked up our pace. He was moving slowly, so we created distance easily. I told Mark it was strange and that the guy didn't look homeless. His clothes were too clean, too crisp. Something about him felt wrong. Mark agreed. We kept walking for a while. A few streets later, on another busy stretch of Charleston, we looked toward a shop and saw him again. That same man, with the same shambling movement. He was far down the street, diagonal to us, moving at the same slow pace. Somehow, he caught up to us, even though there was no clear way he could have reached that spot without us seeing him. I pointed him out to Mark, and we both stared. It made no sense. He was in a completely different part of the city, but moving exactly the same way. We pushed it aside and kept exploring Charleston. The next day was July 4th, and that night we watched the fireworks on an island about 20 minutes from the city. By then, we had mostly forgotten about the man in the suit. We assumed he was just some strange person wandering around, but something about him set off alarm bells. It felt out of place, wrong. That night, we decided to go on a ghost tour, which we had already planned before the trip. It was my last night in Charleston on July 5th, and the city was packed. It was a busy Saturday night with crowds everywhere, lights pouring from restaurants, and that historical atmosphere Charleston has after sunset. We finished the ghost tour and walked through the main area of the city, filled with restaurants and nightlife. The street was crowded, and a particular wave of people was moving toward us, and quite fast. As this group approached, both Mark and I noticed something at the exact same moment. It was him, the same man in the same wedding suit, with the same bow tie and the same black curly hair, shambling in the middle of the crowd as if he had been placed there. He stood out instantly. His movement was completely different from everyone else. He didn't blend in. No one around him noticed him. Two people were walking right beside him, and he brushed between them without either of them reacting. He kept the same slow, unsettling pace while the entire crowd moved normally around him. He glanced at us for a brief second, and then continued forward. It was as if he was tied to the movement of the crowd without truly being part of it. Mark and I looked at each other in shock. It made no sense. He didn't belong there, and something in both of us recognized that immediately. We watched him move down the street until the crowd thinned out. When it did, we saw him clearly, still shambling,
still moving at that same unnatural pace, disappearing into a darker side street until he turned a corner. We were quiet, not panicking, but deeply unsettled. The same man in the same suit appearing multiple times in different parts of the city, always shambling, always out of place. Both of us knew something was wrong. Later that night, we returned to the house. Mark went upstairs to his room, and I went downstairs to sleep. I shut the blinds and tried to settle in. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a tap on the window. I froze. After a few moments, I forced myself to look. I lifted the blinds slightly and looked down the alley. At the far end, I saw the back of a man turning the corner. It was him again. He moved out of sight, but right before he disappeared, he looked back toward the window. I told Mark the next morning. I explained what I saw, and even he admitted that the entire experience was disturbing. He doesn't believe in anything paranormal, and he's extremely logical and grounded, but even he was shaken. As for me, I'm more spiritually sensitive, and this experience stayed with me, and I also know it's with Mark months later. We'll never forget that weekend. The man in the suit felt real and unreal at the same time. Something about all of it was off. I drove home to Florida on July 6th, and the image of him turning that corner has stayed with me ever since. I never thought I would be the kind of person who double checks door locks or memorizes the sounds of my own floorboards, but that changed after 1 week last winter. I live alone in a small house I bought a few years ago, and my routine has been boring and predictable. I work from home, order groceries, go to the gym late at night, and I don't talk to my neighbors much at all. That routine is why it took me longer than it should have to realize something was wrong. It started with a noise I heard around 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was half asleep on the couch with the TV still on low when I heard what sounded like a soft thump near the back of the house. It wasn't loud enough to scare me, and my first thought was that something had fallen in the kitchen or maybe the house had shifted. We all hear sounds like that in the house or apartment once in a while, right? I muted the TV so I could listen. Nothing else happened. I checked the back door, made sure it was locked, and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed the back door felt different when I opened it. The deadbolt still worked, but the handle felt loose, like it had been twisted too hard. I made a mental note to fix it later. That night, I went to the gym around 11 p.m. like I usually do. Side note, I like an empty gym, and I got back around midnight to 12:30. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my porch light was off, yet I always leave it on. I stood there in my car for a few seconds trying to remember if I had turned it off earlier, then I convinced myself I probably did. Inside, everything looked normal. I walked through every room just doing an innocent little analysis before going to bed, something I had never done before. On Thursday morning, I woke up to my alarm and noticed my phone was at 12% battery. I always charge it overnight, and I clearly remembered plugging it in. The cable was still connected to my phone, but the charger was no longer connected to the outlet. Weird. I told myself I must have knocked it loose in my sleep, but that explanation didn't really make sense because my phone was still on the nightstand, not in bed with me. At that moment, my only explanation was I picked up my phone in the middle of the night, accidentally yanked it off the outlet without realizing, and set it back down. I started paying closer attention after that. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting in the dark with the TV off, just listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard slow thumps coming from the back of the house. Footsteps? I asked myself. Nah, it can't be. I held my breath, but the thumps seemingly stopped. After a while, I convinced myself the thumps came from outside. I'm in the suburbs, there's of course other people around, even at night. The next day, I found muddy shoe prints on the floor near the back door. The thing is, though, the footprints weren't clear, like I couldn't distinctly make out patterns of the bottoms of the shoes, which made it look like someone tried to wipe them off before walking around. My stomach literally skipped a beat. I stood there staring at them, trying to understand how they got there. I hadn't had anyone over.
I hadn't gone outside in muddy shoes. I checked the back door again, and this time I noticed faint scratch marks around the lock, like someone had used something thin to pry at it. I called the locksmith and told him I thought my lock was failing. I didn't say anything about the footprints. He replaced the lock that afternoon and told me everything should be fine. That night, I pushed a chair under the back door handle and slept with my bedroom door locked, something I never did before then. I woke up just before 4 in the morning to the sound of something tapping lightly on my bedroom door. It wasn't a knock. It sounded like someone testing the door with their fingertips. I stayed completely still, staring at the door, my eyes burning because I refused to blink. The tapping stopped after a minute, and then I heard soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, the chair was still under the back door, but the back door itself was unlocked. The new lock wasn't damaged, it had just been turned, and that's when reality truly set in. I wasn't just imagining these things like I thought I was because I was tired. Someone had been inside my house while I was asleep and knew how to unlock the door from the inside. I called the police and tried to explain without sounding insane. They checked the house, looked around the yard, and told me there was no sign of forced entry. But yeah, that was kind of obvious given that I changed the lock. They suggested I might have unlocked the door myself without remembering. I knew that wasn't true, but there was nothing they could do either way. That night, I stayed awake with all the lights on and a kitchen knife on the table in front of me. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something from down in the basement. The basement door, which was just outside of the kitchen, was cracked open. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I stared down the hallway to the cracked open basement door. I walked over to it, peeked down through just what the crack in the door would allow me to see, and I swear it was not my imagination. I saw either at the bottom of the stairs, or maybe one of the bottommost steps, the outline of someone standing there. I don't know if they were looking up or not. When I realized what I was looking at, I slammed the door shut and sprinted out to my car. I sat in my car as I once again called 911. After police showed up a second time, they entered while I waited in one of their cars. They brought him out of the house in handcuffs a few minutes later. He was barefoot and wearing dark clothes that looked like they had been slept in. He didn't look at me once. I just don't think that he noticed me in the back of the car. They put him in the back of the other car and shut the door. I stayed outside while more officers went back in, and I refused to look at the guy in the back of the car. I was actually shaking. Even as I talked to the officers, I was stuttering in shock. It took longer than I expected for them to finish the rest of their search. When one of the officers finally came out, he asked how long I had lived there. I told him a few years. He nodded and wrote something down. He asked what time I usually went to the gym and which nights. I told him. He looked back at the house and told me they found food wrappers and bottled water behind the furnace in the basement, along with a phone charger plugged into an outlet down there. He said it looked like someone had been sleeping on the concrete using old insulation as padding. The man hadn't spoken a word to the officers. The main officer I was talking to told me the likely charges the man would be facing, but that ultimately it would be up to the district attorney. Eventually, they told me I could go back inside. It was days later that I was going through my camera roll to send my friend something when I found a very, very disturbing picture. At first, I had to process how a picture like this could be taken. It was a picture of me, in my bed, sleeping, taken at 3:11 a.m. It was the same night that I woke up in the morning to my phone being unplugged from the wall outlet. The nightmare became real all over again. I contacted the unit listed on the incident report, and they asked me to come in to digitally transfer the photo for supplemental evidence. I was told that with this photo, he'd likely be facing additional charges such as stalking or even being registered as a sex offender for life. All good things to hear. It doesn't save me, however, from the trauma I'll forever have to live with thinking back to this shit. I'll never be able to go down into a basement alone at night again in my life. Back when I was 20, during the summer before my senior year of college, I landed an internship at a financial services firm downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, mostly data entry, spreadsheets, and sitting in front of a computer all day, but it paid decently and it looked great on a resume. There were 7 other interns behind me, and we were all crammed together in this open office section with rows of cubicles that didn't quite give you privacy, just enough to make small talk feel optional. Out of the 7, 5 of them were people I liked, a mix of chill, down-to-earth college students who didn't take the internship too seriously. Another guy, Eric, was the type who treated the whole thing like it was life or death, barely spoke, and was always typing like his keyboard owed him money. But the 7th intern, Alex, was something else entirely. When I first met Alex, he seemed normal enough, maybe a little awkward, but we all were at the beginning. He was tall, thin, kind of pale, and had this mop of dark hair that always looked a little unwashed. He didn't really fit the finance intern stereotype, but that's not what threw me off. It was the way he acted around me. At first, it was subtle. He'd pop up at my cubicle during the day, lean over the divider in a way that made him look freakishly tall, like 7 feet tall because the cubicle walls were low, and only his head would be visible above it. He'd tilt his head slightly, grin with a strange frozen smile, and start talking in this deliberately weird voice, like he was trying to sound creepy on purpose. I'd laugh it off awkwardly, pretending I thought it was funny, but I remember thinking it was an odd thing to do in a professional setting. He'd say random stuff, like working hard or hardly working, Ronnie, in that slow, unnatural tone, and then hold the smile for way too long. The first couple of times, I figured he was just being quirky or trying too hard to stand out. Some people at internships are awkward like that, so I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But then it started happening more often. Every single day, at least once, I'd see his head slowly rise above my cubicle wall. That same stretched grin plastered across his annoying face, and he'd start some bizarre conversation that didn't make sense. Sometimes he'd make jokes that weren't funny, or mutter random phrases that didn't relate to anything. And every time, he used that same unsettling voice, like a soft voice in a kind of taunting way. Honestly, a very good recent comparison of the voice he was doing was the voice Charlie Hunnam did for his role as Ed Gein. The other interns noticed it too, but they mostly laughed it off, thinking Alex was being weird on purpose to lighten the mood. I also think they thought Alex and I had built some kind of rapport that the rest of them didn't build with him. There was something about the way he directed it only at me that made me feel uncomfortable. It's not like I treated him any differently. It was like I was his personal audience for whatever creepy act he was trying to pull. As the weeks went on, his visits got longer. He'd lean over and stay there for minutes at a time, staring at me while talking. Sometimes not even saying much, just looking. I'd fake a laugh, say I had to finish a report, and hope he'd get the hint. He rarely did. Then one night, about 6 weeks into the internship, I was home eating dinner when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I normally don't answer unknown calls, but since I was expecting a delivery confirmation, I picked it up. When I said hello, all I heard for a few seconds was silence. Then, suddenly, I heard a voice I recognized immediately. It was Alex's voice. The same forced, creepy tone he always used in the office. He said, "The tide's coming in. Pull your boat out of the water." But this time, his voice was a little louder, almost a yell. He dragged the words out like he was reciting a riddle, and then he burst out laughing this insanely unhinged laugh before hanging up. The thing that made my skin crawl wasn't just the call. It was the fact that I never gave Alex my number, not once. The next thing I did was text the number back, asking if this was Alex. But the text said not delivered, and when I looked it up, it was a landline number. That's when I really started to get freaked out. How did he get my number? Why was he calling me like that? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he found it through a company contact sheet or something. But even then, the way he said that line didn't sit with me. I couldn't stop replaying the sound of his laugh in my head. It didn't sound like someone joking around. It sounded like he was with me to the point of trying to actually scare me. This wasn't just goofy behavior anymore. That Monday, when I got to the office, Alex wasn't there. His desk was empty, and I didn't see him all morning. I went to our supervisor, a guy named Martin, and I asked him if Alex might have gotten my number through the company. And Martin was very confused, saying interns didn't have access to employee info like that. On top of that, they'd let Alex go at the end of the previous week because he wasn't doing any work and had ignored multiple warnings. That's when I told him about the call. He seemed surprised, and some of the other interns overheard. A couple of them started nodding and saying they always thought Alex was creepy, that he'd made them uncomfortable too. I told them about the weird cubicle visits, the voice, everything. Martin said not to worry, that Alex was gone for good and had no reason to come back. So that was a little comforting. For the next week or so, I kept expecting something else to happen. A message, a random encounter, something, but nothing came. Life at the office went back to normal. I figured maybe that was really the end of it. Until one early morning. It was a Friday, around 5 a.m. Still dark outside, except for a thin gray light creeping in through the blinds. I woke up because I thought I'd heard something, maybe a noise from outside. It made me get up and look out my window. I wish I hadn't. Standing in my backyard, halfway between the trees and the porch light, was a figure looking up at my window. Even though it was barely light out, I could tell who it was immediately. The thin frame and the messy hair, the way he stood perfectly straight. It was Alex. For a few seconds, I could not move. I just stared at him, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, clear as day, I heard him call out my name in that same creepy, performative voice he'd always used at work. He dragged it out, long and sing-songy. I grabbed my phone, about to call 911, when I saw him tilt his head back and start laughing. That same loud, hysterical laughter like he did on the phone before hanging up. It didn't sound right. It sounded like someone completely detached from reality. I shouted through the window, yelling at him that I was calling the police and to get the hell off my property. I also waved my phone out the window. He just stood there for a second longer, then turned and started walking away, still laughing as he disappeared into the trees behind my house. I called the police, and in short, the dispatcher asked me if he was still there. When I said no, she told me to call back if he came back or threatened to break in. I never saw him again after that. Not at work, not around town, nowhere. The police couldn't do much since he hadn't technically broken in or made a direct threat. It was one of those situations where you just have to live with the unease, hoping it's over. The rest of the summer passed without incident. I finished the internship, and on the last day, my boss pulled me aside to offer me a permanent position for after graduation. At the time, I accepted, though a small part of me felt unsettled about ever going back to that office again. I never told them about what had happened that morning. I didn't see the point. Alex was gone, and no one even knew where he'd ended up. Over time, I convinced myself that he must have been dealing with some kind of mental illness or social disorder, something that made him act that way. It's the only way I can make sense of how he went from a quiet, awkward intern to standing in my backyard at 5 a.m, laughing like a lunatic. It's been a few years now, and I've moved on from it. I didn't end up with that company. I got a different job after graduation. I don't think about this too often anymore, but sometimes the thought of that image of him in my backyard still skeeves me out. I still wonder how he got my number, how he found my address, and what he wanted that morning. I guess it's not that hard to get people's info online these days. All I know is that for a few months in my life, I worked alongside someone who wasn't just strange, he had something way deeper going on. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the sound of him laughing in the dark, as if it was all one big joke that only he understood. I was 17 when this all happened. It was my first real job, working at a local grocery store in our quiet Vermont town. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and where nothing ever really happened. I liked the job at first. It was simple, and most of my coworkers were friendly. I quickly fell into a rhythm with the cashiers and some of the stock workers, especially during the slow hours when there weren't many customers. When that happened, we'd all gather near the front of the store, just chatting about random stuff like what we watched on TV, making fun of the older, quirkier employees, and complaining about customers. That sort of thing. It was one of the few times during my shifts where I felt like I wasn't just standing behind a register staring at a screen or a blank wall all day. Depending on who was the shift supervisor for the day, it would either be relaxed or more strict. Like if a younger supervisor was working, it would be more chill. People would be on their phones and people would socialize by the front. There was one coworker who I didn't know well at first, a guy named Sean. He was 24, a little awkward, the kind of guy who always seemed like he didn't quite know how to read social cues. He had longer hair, but kind of in the awkward in-between phase, like he was growing it out but didn't quite reach his shoulders yet. He worked in the dairy section, so we didn't interact much at work. He was quiet and polite enough, and I honestly didn't think much of him. Most people just nodded at him when they walked past, and he did the same. But eventually, I was added to a coworker group chat, and he was in it. I didn't think twice about it. It was just a chat for work stuff and dumb jokes, and it seems most of the younger employees were in there. But then Sean started messaging me directly. At first it was harmless. He asked about my shifts, whether I was covering certain days, things like that. But over the next few weeks, it became clear he was trying to get closer. He started asking questions about my personal life, like what music I liked, what I do after work, even little things like what I did over the weekend. Again, I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people make small talk, right? But the tone was off. Sometimes he'd call me cute in ways that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes he'd make jokes that were slightly flirty. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe he just didn't know how to behave with girls my age. That's another thing. I was only 17, he was decently older than me, and I don't think anyone else knew he was flirting with me like that. It didn't take long before the behavior became slightly annoying. He'd comment on things I posted online, and sometimes the messages were late at night. Not threatening, not really, but there was this persistence in him that made me uneasy. I didn't know how to tell him to back off without making it awkward at work, so I mostly ignored him. Don't shit where you eat, I always hear people say. One day, I was at home watching Stranger Things, my favorite show still to this day. I'd been catching up on the latest season, binge watching episodes in my bedroom, just completely lost in the show. And then a couple days later at work, everyone was gathered at the front of the store chatting about TV shows. I was talking with a few of the cashiers about some random series, when Sean suddenly asked me, "You like Stranger Things, right?" I froze. I couldn't remember telling anyone at work about my show. I just nodded, trying to brush it off, but it left this cold feeling in my stomach. How did he know? I didn't say anything. I did make eye contact for a moment. He just smiled awkwardly and eventually left the front of the store back to the dairy section like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me more than I had realized. It wasn't until a few nights later that the fear really started. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep after a long day at work. The house was quiet, and then I heard a soft scraping noise against my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But then I heard it again. A distinct sound of someone tapping on the window, just lightly enough for it to be unnerving. I got up and peeked through the blinds, half expecting to see Sean out there, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself the sound was nothing to be alarmed about, but the thought of Sean's question at work, about Stranger Things, a show I hadn't told anyone about, it kept running through my head. A couple of days later, he texted me again. This time I didn't ignore it. I told him clearly and firmly that I wasn't interested. That was when things escalated. Almost immediately, he replied, "Okay, good luck changing your address." I couldn't believe it. In one insane text that he clearly sent before thinking of the repercussions, he proved my suspicions right. I saved the messages and took screenshots. I went straight to my manager and explained everything. My manager was shocked. He told me not to worry, that they'd handle it. I also went with my dad to the local police department to file a report, showing them the messages and explaining the incident with the window, explaining that I suspected Sean might be stalking me. The next day at work, Sean was called in by our boss. He didn't come back. It turned out he was fired on the spot, and the police started the paperwork for a restraining order. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but I quickly realized that nothing really felt over. Even with the restraining order in place, if he was actually a crazy person, what's a piece of paper gonna do to stop him from coming back to the house and doing something crazy? I double-checked locks obsessively, refused to answer any calls or messages from unknown numbers, and avoided talking about my routines with anyone except family. The weeks dragged on like that. I would wake up at night convinced I heard something outside. I had to remind myself constantly that the restraining order was legally binding, that he couldn't come near me, but the fear was real. Eventually, as the weeks turned into months, the paranoia started to fade. There were no incidents, no attempts to contact me, no sudden appearances. The restraining order seemed to hold, and life slowly returned to normal. I got more comfortable going out alone, stopped checking my window obsessively before bed, and eventually, I stopped thinking about Sean altogether. It took a long time, though, for me to feel fully safe again. Even after moving on, the experience left a mark. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, cautious about new people I met, especially in situations where I felt isolated. I learned to trust my instincts and take any uncomfortable behavior seriously, no matter how small it seemed at first. Looking back, the thing that scares me most isn't that Sean might have actually harmed me. It's how quickly someone who seems normal, even awkward or harmless, can turn into a source of fear. It can start with small, seemingly innocent interactions, messages, questions, little comments, and escalate into something far more serious. Now, years later, I've moved past it. I work in a different town, live in a new apartment, and I don't think about that grocery store anymore. I don't talk to a single coworker from that job anymore. But the memory of those nights lying in bed, convinced someone was outside my window, it's not something that ever goes away entirely. It's a reminder of how quickly life can feel unsafe, even in a small, quiet town where nothing ever seems to happen. And while Sean never came close to doing anything physically, the psychological impact was enough to make me question how safe I ever truly was. So if you're ever at work and notice a coworker crossing a line, even subtly, take it seriously. Don't brush it off as awkwardness or harmless flirting. It might seem over the top at first, but it could save you from months of fear, or worse. Because sometimes, the danger isn't obvious. But eventually, I did move on. And now, years later, I can look back and say I survived. And that's enough. When I was 26, I started working at a small insurance office in a quiet part of Pennsylvania. The kind of office that's tucked behind a strip mall with one long row of desks, flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of coffee at all hours of the day. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked most of the people there. The job could get boring, especially on slow days when the phones barely rang, but it was easy money. I usually worked the day shift, but on this particular Friday, I was scheduled to help close up the office because we were behind on filing a batch of client records. There was a big storm warning that afternoon, the kind that takes over the entire local news broadcast. The moment I woke up and looked out the window that morning, I knew it was going to be a dark, stormy day. And around 3 o'clock, the rain started to pour so heavily you couldn't see the end of the street. The thunder came soon after, shaking the windows every few minutes. Honestly, I was personally enjoying the ambiance of the storm. Then the manager decided to let most of the employees leave early before it got worse, but a couple of us volunteered to stay to finish some paperwork. The only other person who stayed was a guy named Tom, who had just started working there about 2 weeks prior. He was in his early 30s, tall, quiet, and sort of off-putting in a way I couldn't describe. I wouldn't say creepy, just strange. He never said much to anyone, but he was always nearby. If I went to make coffee, he'd be there 2 minutes later. If I was restocking paper, he'd show up pretending to do the same thing. I figured he was just socially awkward. When 5 o'clock hit, the storm was in full force. I swear, every few seconds lightning flashed, followed by thunder that made the floor vibrate. The office felt emptier than usual, and the usual hum of lights was replaced by the sound of the storm. Tom was sitting at his desk a few rows down, typing something on his computer that looked like nonsense from where I sat. Every time I looked up, I could see him glancing over in my direction. At first, I tried to focus on my work, but after an hour or so, I realized I hadn't seen him get up once. Around 6:30, the power started flickering. Both of us made the same nervous laugh when the lights dimmed, but he didn't say anything. The next flicker lasted longer, and when the power finally went out completely, the office went silent except for the rain. The emergency lights kicked in, leaving everything bathed in a faint orange glow. I said something about maybe it being a good time to head out, but Tom didn't respond. I heard the sound of keys jingling, and then the front door locking. He muttered something about how it wasn't safe to go outside right now. I thought maybe he was just trying to be helpful, but something about the way he said it gave me chills. I went to grab my bag and jacket, figuring I'd wait it out for a few minutes before heading home. The power outage made the whole building feel smaller. The emergency lights barely lit the hallways, and the storm outside was deafening. When I came back toward the front, Tom was standing near the door, just staring out into the dark parking lot. The rain was falling so heavily you couldn't see anything past the glass. I told him I was going to make a quick call to my boyfriend to let him know I'd be home soon. He didn't say anything again. He stood there staring out the window. I walked toward the break room, but when I tried using my phone, there was no signal. I figured the storm must have knocked out the tower. I tried the landline, but the line was dead too. I turned around to go back to the main office, and nearly jumped when I saw Tom standing in the doorway. I hadn't even heard him walk up. He was holding a small flashlight under his chin, casting shadows up his face. He had this half smile like he thought it was funny. I forced a nervous laugh and told him he scared me. I then asked him again about unlocking the door so I could leave, but he said something about it not being safe yet, and how it was better to wait until the worst of the storm passed. I said fine, but inside I was starting to feel nervous. He kept watching me. I decided to move to my cubicle to pack up my stuff, pretending to be calm. I wanted to wait for a lull in the storm and then get out. When I looked up again a few minutes later, Tom was gone. I figured maybe he went to the restroom. I took the chance to head to the back door instead of the front one. I knew that one led to a small parking lot behind the building where my car was. When I reached it, I realized the handle wouldn't move. The door was chained shut from the inside, like someone had looped a chain and padlock around it. We had never done that before. I turned around and saw the faint glow of the flashlight coming from down the hallway. I ducked into the supply closet next to the break room and closed the door quietly, trying to keep my breathing under control. I could hear Tom walking slowly through the hall, and then I heard him call my name. He sounded like he was trying to sound comforting. He said he just wanted to make sure I was safe. I didn't move or say a word. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could probably hear it. He walked past the closet, and for a few seconds, I could see the thin strip of light from the flashlight shining under the door. Then it disappeared. A loud crack of thunder made the building shake. The sound of rain got even louder for a second, and I realized part of the roof above the break room must have been leaking. I waited, I'd estimate 10 minutes before I finally worked up the nerve to open the door a little. The hall was empty. The flashlight beam was gone. I stepped out carefully and made my way toward the front again. When I turned the corner, I froze. The front glass door had been shattered completely. Rain was blowing inside across the floor, soaking the carpet. Tom was nowhere in sight. I hesitated, wondering if he had gone outside, but then I realized this was my only chance. I ran out the door into the pouring rain and sprinted for my car. I didn't even care that I was getting drenched. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sped out of the parking lot without looking back once. When I finally got home, I locked every door and sat in my living room shaking, watching the rain pour against my windows. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the office and told my manager what had happened. He didn't believe me at first, until he got there himself and saw the broken glass. He called the police, who showed up and took a statement from me when I was at the office. They said they'd look into it, but it sounded like Tom had just taken off. His car was still in the lot, unlocked, with the keys sitting on the driver's seat. His phone, wallet, and a few personal items were still inside. The security cameras had been turned off manually before the power outage, which meant he must have done it earlier in the night. Nobody ever saw him again. A few of my coworkers said maybe he had some kind of breakdown, but I couldn't stop wondering if he'd been planning something worse. I quit the job a month later. Even though nothing ever happened after that, I couldn't work in a small, enclosed place like that where I had experienced such a traumatic incident. It just wasn't healthy. This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. I won't mention the name of the base, but I'm sure that there are many people out there who will know which one it is once I make mention of some of the details to this story. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived to this base in 2006, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that that little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working, but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the shit out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turned off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now, skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base this night. Keep in mind that I'd been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point the storage area had been completely closed down except for a few minor areas, which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks of this area. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Alpha, aka partner, had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol, as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, a cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So come about 4 o'clock in the morning, we decided to do our last check, seeing as all the maintenance guys had went home for the night in this area. The only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We pile in, lock the gates behind us, and continue on our way. My Alpha was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area, which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine, and we had finished our rounds. My Alpha makes the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting the shit, when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio playing seemed to become less audible. As we approached the structure from my previous story, and I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear, but as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite of the structure, and out of my left ear, I hear a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. The faint, creepy moan begins to ring inside the cab of the truck between the 2 of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat.
I feel my blood turn cold, and I quickly turn to my alpha and yell, "Dude, cut that shit out." My alpha turns to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he begins to take his foot off the accelerator and asks, "Am I going too fast?" I remain silent for a moment, with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listen. I hear the noise again. My partner interrupts and asks, "What's wrong?" I quickly turn the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whisper to him, "Do you hear that?" He stops the truck in confusion and listens closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two when we both hear it this time. That long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again, but he quickly interrupts and says with a strong sound of fear in his voice, "What the f*** is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck are easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine has that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time. That groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, my alpha puts the truck in drive, and he hauls our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street in that entire base. He nearly flips the truck going around a curve, but it doesn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly. We got to the two gates again, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. My alpha watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base, and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of shit, or that we had just imagined the entire thing, being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift, and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to the both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place, and the other in that building behind you, as he points at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliche with that grudge-like moan we had heard, but it honestly happened, and it still brings those tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell it. I went back to that storage area only once after that, but I never went down that road again, and I never went after dark. I haven't told my story to many people except for my wife and a few other of my close friends. It happened while I was stationed in the Army as a radio operator during the Vietnam War, and I haven't forgotten it to this day. I was a young recruit, freshly drafted out of high school, and I didn't know much about the war. I had no idea what I was getting into or what it was all for, but what I did know was that I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. We arrived on a Friday evening and got loaded onto many buses to be taken to our barracks. The air was very humid, and the soil was soaking wet due to a storm that had just passed through the area. I vividly remember the drive and how it stunk like sewer. My first night was uneventful and quiet, but we all felt the tense atmosphere as our drill sergeants taunted us with stories during basic training. I remember the half moon right over my head, which kept peeking out from over the clouds, and all of us were just sitting around telling jokes. I was more of a technical guy and didn't have much aptitude for comedy, so I just listened in. My duty was to manage communications between my unit and all of our other guys so that everyone knew what was going on everywhere else. I carried a box on my back, which were the size of radio devices back then, and also a ton more equipment and supplies. I was quickly assigned to a tight-knit unit who had just lost their communications operator to a landmine, and I remember the first time we made contact with the enemy. It was the loudest thing I ever heard. We were in a dense part of the jungle and couldn't see the enemy at all, but we quickly ducked as soon as they began firing at us, and we opened fire in their general direction in return. The chaos seemed to last forever, and we probably ceased fire after a couple of minutes. We advanced forward to close in on the enemy and secure the area, and it was the first time I ever saw the enemy up close. There they were, 3 dead Viet Cong soldiers laying in a pool of their own blood. I couldn't believe that I was looking at 3 human beings that were alive just moments ago. Young guys who maybe had sisters or brothers and parents. They were probably just chilling around moments before we arrived, and here we are moments later, looking at their motionless bodies. But I must say that I felt justified, because they were the enemy, and they would have been standing over our dead bodies instead. A few days later, we got assigned to a different location, which saw heavier casualties and needed more support. I grew accustomed to the violence and saw many of our young men die painfully. One day, I was told by my NCO that someone wanted to speak with me. I was greeted by an older man in his late 50s who looked totally out of place. His demeanor was calculated and predictive, and even my commanding officer seemed to have turned into a yes man in front of him. He introduced himself as Frederick Douglass, an intelligence officer stationed nearby, and that I was going to be assigned to him as an RTO for his unit. I liked my unit and wanted to stay with them, but orders are orders, and I had no choice, so I got on the Huey and went with him. We landed in a heavily wooded area next to a few Viet Cong huts. It was heavily built up by the enemy, and I could definitely imagine the fight that must have taken place here. There were some guys who had gas masks on and others standing nearby, but they didn't seem to notice me or even care that I was there. It was a very strange atmosphere that didn't feel quite right. These guys didn't act like normal soldiers and definitely didn't have the look of fear in their eyes as most of us did. I even tried to talk with some of them, but all I got was a strange, emotionless glare like they were infected with something. Whatever it was, they all had it, and it made me feel very uneasy. Officer Douglas and I entered one of the smaller huts, and I was told to stay put until someone would come and get me. I should have just stayed there and waited, but I was too curious and apprehensive to relax. So I just made my way out towards the main tent and took a peek inside. What I saw made my stomach drop like it never had before. On a makeshift table lay 6 murky containers. Each one of them had a severed head of a guerrilla fighter inside, with several tubes and wires protruded from them. A green liquid seemed to be reacting with the heads, as their mouths and eyes were quivering like they were half alive. I suddenly felt a hand grab onto my shoulder. It was Intelligence Officer Douglas, and he looked very upset. I meekly asked what they were doing inside there, but he angrily said that I should not have gone in there and sent me back to my hut. We must have been attacked or something, because I woke up a day later in triage with several broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, with no memory of anything that happened right after that. I never saw Officer Frederick Douglass or those soldiers ever again during my time, if that was even his real name. And I often wonder what those guys were doing back there. Maybe they were trying to gather intelligence from dead enemy soldiers or something. Either way, it was a strange experience that I'll never forget. All names in the story will be changed, and all locations will be left out. This experience has left me very paranoid in a lot of ways. It was the late hours of the night. I could feel the thud of my heartbeat inside of my chest as our armored vehicle veered off the gravel road, plowing through the dense underbrush. It had been weeks since Bravo unit had gone silent, vanishing like a wisp of smoke on a windy day. The distress call had crackled through our comms earlier, an unexpected sign of life from our long-missing comrades. But what haunted me more than their sudden reemergence was the content of their message. A cryptic string of numbers repeating endlessly. "Sergeant Davis, are you sure this is the place?" I asked over the static hiss of the radio cutting through the silence that had settled over our squad. "That's what command confirmed. Get ready," Davis replied. As our vehicle came to a halt, the dense fog seemed to get worse. We disembarked into the unknown, the silence of the abandoned base growing increasingly unsettling. Buildings stood like hollowed-out husks, with windows shattered, doors ajar. A living town not even a few weeks ago, now just a ghost town. Davis ordered us in a whisper to stay sharp as we moved forward, with our boots crunching on broken glass and debris. Signs of a struggle were everywhere. Overturned furniture, bloodied rags, and scattered ammunition littered the ground, painting a picture of the chaos that had taken place here recently. The base, once a bustling hub of military activity, was eerily silent now, except for our own shallow breaths and the distant, echoing cry of the numbers broadcast. As we neared the command center, the transmission grew louder, a constant chant that seemed to bore into my mind. its meaning as elusive as the shadows in the fog surrounding us. Entering the command center, we found it abandoned, the air stale, the only light coming from the blinking consoles. The radio speakers, crackling with static, repeated the sequence over and over in a monotone voice.
5, 8, 2, 4, 7. 5, 8, 2, 4, 7.
Corporal Lee whispered, "What does it mean?" I saw her eyes were wide as she scanned the room. Commander Haskins might have known, Davis said. Commander Haskins was the name of the unit's leader who had vanished along with his team. We continued our search through the desolate base, hoping to find a clue, a survivor, anything. But it was the laboratory that changed everything. The door was ajar, hanging off its hinges as if forced open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and chemicals. Shattered vials and overturned equipment were signs of activity halted abruptly. And then we saw them. Bodies. Members of Bravo Unit, or what was left of them, were sprawled across the floor, their faces contorted in expressions of terror. It was a massacre. But the cause was unclear. No bullet wounds, no signs of struggle on their remains. And then, Lee gestured toward a corner of the room. There, amidst the pile of research notes and hastily abandoned experiments, lay the body of Commander Haskins. Clutched in his stiff, lifeless hand was a notepad, the numbers 58247 scrawled across it in shaky handwriting, followed by a single, chilling sentence, "They're coming for us." The revelation struck us like a physical blow, the implications of his words spiraling into a million questions with no answers. Who was coming for them? Was this distress call not a beacon of hope, but a warning? It was then that the reality of our situation descended upon us. The isolation, the eerie silence broken only by that relentless string of numbers. We were not the rescuers. We were the next victims. Panic set in as the base seemed to close in on us. The fog outside felt like it was thickening. Our only choice was to flee. We ran, stumbling through the fog, guided by the distant light of our vehicle. The numbers continued to echo in my mind, a chant that seemed to follow us, whispering through the fog. Just as the vehicle came into view, a shadow emerged from the mist. A chill colder than death itself crawled up my spine as the strange man cloaked in shadow moved towards us. "We need to go now." Davis's shout snapped me back to reality, the urgency in his voice mirroring a primal fear within me. Our training had prepared us for many different types of enemies, but we had no idea what we were dealing with here. We scrambled into the vehicle. Lee's hands were shaking as she manned the communications, with obvious fear and shaking in her voice. "This is Alpha Unit calling command. Mayday, Mayday. We need immediate extraction from Zone Bravo. Do you copy? Over." The radio crackled, the numbers interrupting her plea for help.
5, 8, 2, 4, 7.
I couldn't shake the feeling that those numbers held some kind of meaning into what we had stumbled into. As the base faded into the distance, swallowed by the fog, so too did the person who emerged from the shadows of the fog. Yet the terror it inspired lingered as we raced toward an uncertain future. Davis broke the silence and said, "We can't let this end here. We need to find out what those numbers mean and what happened to Bravo Unit." I wanted nothing more than to find these things out as well. I felt like we owed it to them, thinking of the twisted, lifeless bodies we'd left behind. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, I felt a grim determination settle over me. We had survived the night, but the real battle felt like it was just beginning. Armed with nothing but a string of numbers and the haunting memories of what we had witnessed, the mystery of those numbers and the horrors of what could have happened to Bravo Unit still remain a mystery. And it stays with me, haunting me. I'm sure it stays with everyone from my unit. The horrors at that base were just a chapter in a story far greater and more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. This happened back in 2017 when I was living in St. Petersburg, Florida. I've always been a homebody, so when my coworker Jenna, who is about 10 years younger than me, started relentlessly begging me to go out, I kept declining. She and another girl from work, Mira, were persistent though, and after weeks of asking, I finally gave in. I told Jenna I would join them for a night out the following weekend. As the weekend approached, Jenna came to my apartment. She wanted to leave her car there and have me drive, which immediately stressed me out. I had lived in St. Pete for 4 years, but since I rarely left my neighborhood, I knew nothing about local nightlife. The farthest I usually drove was 4 miles to the nearest Walmart. If I went any further, I'd be lost without my GPS. That evening, we got into my car and headed toward Mira's apartment. When we arrived, Mira wasn't quite ready, so we went inside and waited. Once she was ready, all 3 of us piled back into my car. Since I was driving, Jenna had to navigate. We eventually ended up at a busy club. We went inside, found a spot, and ordered some drinks. We hadn't been there long when Jenna said, "Hey, I'll be right back. I see someone I know." She then asked Mira to go with her. I remember feeling a sharp stab of annoyance. Why beg me to come out only to leave me alone moments later? But I waited. A few minutes later, Jenna and Mira returned, smiling. "My friend brought us around," Jenna announced, handing me a glass. I trusted her, she was my coworker, so I took the drink, as they did theirs. I believe Jenna's friend bought us 2 rounds each. It wasn't long after the 3rd drink that something felt terribly wrong. The room didn't spin, but a wave of thick, unsettling dread washed over me. I turned to Jenna and insisted we have to go now. The next few hours are a blur. I don't remember leaving the club, but apparently we did. The first thing I recall clearly is sitting outside Mira's apartment complex, still in the driver's seat of my car. I heard Jenna and Mira talking, and whatever they said, some combination of words I can't recall to this day, instantly triggered my fight or flight response. I didn't need to understand the words. My gut knew I was in danger. I slammed the car into drive and sped away. Whatever had been slipped into my drink was powerful. I wasn't a lightweight, and I'd only consumed 3 club drinks, which are often watered down. I was driving all over St. Pete, unable to focus, simply trying to figure out how to get home. But my mind was completely scrambled. At one point, I stopped at a red light. Suddenly, 2 figures appeared at my window, and then someone was pulling my car door open. I was in total shock. My car doors automatically locked the second I put the vehicle in gear. I still have no idea how they managed to open it. 2 strange men were actively pulling the door open, and the sight snapped me out of the mental fog just enough for me to hit the gas and flee the intersection. After that moment of sheer terror, the memory vanishes again. The next thing I remember, I was sitting in my car parked near a row of quiet homes. I was staring blankly at my phone, trying desperately to figure out how to operate it. But the drug had made me so paranoid and confused that the simplest action felt impossible. I looked around, saw no one, and convinced myself I was safe for the moment. I reclined the seat and fell into a deep, drug-induced sleep. I woke up around 5 a.m. with the drug wearing off. I was finally able to use my phone. I put on the GPS and drove straight home, collapsing into bed immediately. I woke up again around 11 a.m. to 20 missed calls, mostly from Jenna, but a few from a concerned friend. When I called Jenna back, she was frantic, demanding to know where I went. "What do you mean?" I retorted. "Your friend spiked my drink, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going to happen next," I told her. Jenna then let slip a chilling line. "Well, the spiked drinks weren't meant for you." That casual admission was all the confirmation I needed that she was involved. She quickly told me that she would stop by later to pick up her vehicle. Before she arrived, the memory of those 2 guys opening my door returned with jarring clarity. Had it been a hallucination, or was it real? I went outside to check my car, and there it was. The plastic casing of my driver's side door handle was completely missing. Whoever had been holding onto that handle when I sped away must have ripped it right off. The physical damage confirmed that the terror I felt wasn't a delusion. Someone had tried to get into my car while I was drugged, driving alone, and vulnerable. I was furious that Jenna had put me in such a predicament. I never spoke to her again. The moral of this terrifying story is simple, and it's the only reason I'm still here. Always trust your instincts. Your gut feelings are always right. I'm a teenager that lives in a lively coastal town in a small enough country. It's very popular among tourists during the summer, and becomes quiet during the other seasons. The main attraction of our town is the beach that stretches a few kilometers down to these sand dunes that are great for a scenic walk. The hills within are easy to get lost in, but at the same time easy to make your way out of, as if you walk a kilometer in any direction, you're sure to be back on the beach or on the path that leads back to a car park. The walk from this car park is around 15 to 20 minutes, provided you make good pace, so you're never truly isolated there. During the day, you'll always see families with young kids taking a stroll down there, or somebody walking the dog. My point here is that the dunes are known to be safe during the day, and if you get lost in them, you shouldn't panic. This story takes place a few weeks after school started back up, so town is quieter and the evenings grow darker. My friends and I are part of the local scout group. Our group is split into 4 groups, being Beavers for ages 5 to 8, Cubs for 9 to 12, Scouts for 12 to 15, and lastly, Ventures for ages 16 to 18. We meet every Thursday from 7 to 9 p.m., whether it be inside or outside, it depends on the time of year. On this night, it was the Scouts' first night back after the summer break, so as per the tradition, we meet at the car park by the walk to the sand dunes, and the Scouts would walk down to the sand dunes. We would have the older Scouts hike up the biggest of the dunes, and then have the newer Scouts, the 12-year-olds, follow them so the older Scouts help the newer Scouts to reach the top. And when they do, they're officially considered Scouts. So the Scouts set off, while me and the other 8 Ventures stayed behind to practice our first aid for about 45 minutes. We did pretty well in that, and we decided we still had time to go to the dunes. The quicker walkers, including myself, reached the dunes first. The tide was fully in, so we weren't able to walk on the beach to the biggest dune, which was known as the Baldy Man, so we just walked through the other hills of the dunes. My friend and I, who I'll call Noah, were set on reaching the Scouts, who at this point had all made it to the top of the Baldy Man. We shouted back to our leader and the other Ventures what we were going to do, and another 2 people decided to join us, who I'll call Thomas and Ewan. The others were a good bit behind, so they went into pairs and split up in checkpoints, so the 4 of the people going to see the Scouts were able to find our way back. So me, Noah, Thomas, and Ewan took off in the near pitch black dunes, tripping and falling all over the place, going up and down, hill after hill, while scraping our legs on the pointed grass and the occasional bramble. The moon illuminated the silhouette of the Scouts, and we were further away than we thought. We stopped to rest on a ridge where we looked back and saw another 2 Ventures looking towards us. We gave them a wave, and they returned it. I was closing my bottle of water, getting ready to run again, when Thomas shushed us all. He looked mildly concerned at first, but he seemed to shrug it off. We questioned him as to why he shushed us, to which he replied, "Did you hear that?" We shook our heads, so Thomas said he thought he heard something rustling in the bushes, but we put it down to the wind, although it was a very still night. After another 10 minutes, we were on the last hill before we reached the Scouts, and we were exhausted, but we pushed through and made it up to them. We said hello to our friends and Scouts, welcomed the new Scouts, and decided we had to head back, as it was now basically pitch black out. And again, we had no torch. We tumbled down the big hill, catching our footing again on the sand, and we began making our way back to the Ventures we saw on the ridge. We ran up and down the hills again until we made out the outline of the ridge we saw the Ventures on. They were still there. We were relieved to see them there, even though we knew they would be. Finally, the 4 of us made it up to them. I'll call the 2 Cormac and Alice. Cormac is a big guy muscle-wise, and is known in school for his intelligence. He's about 6'3" and looks like he could beat up a bear in a fist fight. Alice is a quiet girl but very smart, both in school and in social situations. Even without a torch, I could see a look of panic on Cormac's face, along with Alice visibly shaking beside him. "What's wrong?" asked Noah, speaking all our minds. Cormac looks me dead in the eyes and says, "Were you walking around on your own down there?" Pointing down to a clearing in the hills where people might come to have a drink or a smoke. "No, I've been with the others the whole time. Why?" I replied, feeling my heart rate increase. I think all of us had the same realization at the same time. We could nearly feel each other's blood run cold. "Alice and I saw a man with his hood up, dressed in all black, circling this clearing, obviously avoiding us. We thought it was you at first, but it was too out of character for you," Cormac said, looking at me. I was about to speak, but Cormac kept going. He said, "When we waved at you from the other ridge, we hadn't seen this guy yet, but the minute you were off of it, we saw what I assume is the same guy standing where you stood, looking in your direction." It hit me then, and I had a constant shiver running through me. Thomas must have heard him moving around when we were up there. We were being followed. There's safety in numbers, so the 6 of us made our way down to the clearing where the man was spotted. "He didn't even have a torch," said Alice in a shaky voice. Cormac and Alice rushed toward the scouts to warn their leaders about the situation, while the other 4 of us stayed back and kept watch in the clearing. Cormac and Alex came back quickly after warning the scouts. It was oddly quiet now. We were terrified that this man, dressed in all black without a torch, circling the place, and most scary of all, alone in the pitch-black dunes, was going to jump out and attack. Luckily, that never happened. We hurried back to the car park, finding the last 3 venturers along with our leader on the way back, notifying them of the situation. We were nearly out of the dunes when one of the younger scouts let out a scream which prompted all the others to run. Noah and I, leading the walk back, were the ones who rushed to the kid first. The poor child was in tears, and when we asked him what happened, he pointed to my left. There he was, the same man, standing on a ridge, just looking at us. Noah told everyone to run, as he said he saw a knife in the man's hand. The Ventures all carried the slower children back to the car park, which was safe as far as we assumed. I never saw the man's face, nor do I plan on finding out who it was. The scouts and Ventures were collected by their parents, who I assume all have their versions of the story, but only a handful know the full one. This happened when I was 22 years old. I was working as a bartender at a small dive bar a few blocks from my apartment. By no means a fancy place, just a bunch of locals who would come and get their late night drinks or to watch whatever games were on. I started recognizing regulars pretty quickly, a lot of them older guys. After my shifts, I usually walked home because it was so close, and sometimes I'd have a couple shots with customers near closing times, so driving wasn't smart. The walk only took about 7 minutes, and I had done it so many times that I never really felt scared before. There was one regular who always made me uncomfortable, though. His name was Jared. I knew this because of his credit card. He looked to be around his late 30s, maybe 38. He had thinning hair and always wore the same brown jacket no matter the weather. He never came in with friends. He would sit at the bar alone and try to talk to me the entire time, showing no interest in any of the sports games that would be on. But he'd usually be there later in the night anyway. He asked personal questions sometimes, and I always kept my answers short and tried to stay polite because that's part of the job, but I avoided encouraging him. One Friday night, he came in like usual, around 10. He nursed one beer for almost an hour and just watched me while I worked. Not like he was intensively staring at me the entire time, but I'd catch him shooting constant glances at me and he would look away when I'd notice. Almost every time I walked past, he tried to start a conversation. Near the end of his drink, he asked if I wanted to hang out sometime outside of work. I told him I wasn't interested and that I like to keep my work and personal life separate. His face changed right away. He forced a smile, threw some cash on the bar, and said, "Yeah, whatever." Then he left without tipping, which he had never done before. I remember feeling relieved he was gone, but also a little uneasy about how fast his mood shifted. My shift ended at midnight. The other bartender came in to take over, and I counted my tips, grabbed my hoodie, and headed out the front door. The street was quiet like it usually was that late. I had just turned onto the next block when I heard someone say my name. It made my stomach drop right away. I turned and saw Jared, standing near a lamppost. I didn't even hear him walk up. He gave a small wave and started walking toward me. I stopped, but kept some distance. He apologized for storming out earlier, and said that he tends to just get nervous. I told him it was fine, but that I really needed to get home. He nodded and said, I just wanted to ask one more time if I could get your Instagram or Snapchat or something. I promise I won't bother you. I told him I don't use social media. He stared at me for a second, then smiled in a way that made me uncomfortable. He said, That's weird, because I've seen you on Instagram at the bar before. My heart started pounding, because now he was directly confronting me. I had no idea how he knew that. I just said, please leave me alone, because at this point, he escalated things beyond comfort. He kept smiling and said, Okay, have a good night. I turned and started walking again, trying to stay calm. After a few seconds, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, but when I glanced back, I saw him walking the same direction, about half a block behind me. I sped up a little. He sped up too. I slowed down, and he slowed down. It felt like a sick game, like he was some NPC in a video game programmed to match my speed. I kept walking toward my apartment building, hoping maybe he would turn off somewhere, but he didn't. When I reached my building, I crossed the street instead of going straight to the door. I stopped and turned around. He stopped too. He just stood there under a tree, mostly in shadow. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could still somehow tell he was smiling a little. I yelled, Why are you following me? I don't want to have to call out for help. He didn't answer. He just stood there stiffly. I blurted out, My boyfriend lives with me. I'm going inside to get him right now. That was a lie. I lived alone. I turned and hurried to the front door of my building. I hurried and punched in the code for the building. The door buzzed and unlocked for a few seconds. Right as I pulled it open, I heard fast footsteps behind me. I looked back and saw Jared running toward the building. I ran inside and let the door slam shut behind me. I didn't wait to see if it latched fully. I just ran up the stairs to the second floor. My apartment was at the end of the hall. I could hear the main door downstairs push open aggressively, and then footsteps hitting the stairs hard and fast. He made it in. I fumbled with my keys at the door, almost dropping them. I could hear him getting closer, his shoes slamming against each step. I finally got the key in the lock and threw myself inside, slamming the door and locking it just as he reached the hallway. A second later, his whole body smashed into my door. The impact literally shook the whole door and wall. I screamed and backed away, grabbing my phone. He hit the door again, harder this time, like he was trying to break it down. Then I heard another door open in the hallway, and a man's voice yell, "What the hell are you doing?" The banging stopped. There was silence for a second, then footsteps quickly moving away. I looked through the peephole and saw my neighbor, an older guy who lived across from me. He was standing in the hall, looking confused and angry. Jared was already halfway down the stairs, not saying a word. My neighbor knocked gently and asked if I was okay. I opened the door a crack, shaking and crying. I told him everything while he stayed in the hallway with me. He said he had heard the banging and thought someone was trying to break in. I called the police, and they came that night and took everything very seriously. I gave them Jared's name from his credit card at the bar, and the building owner pulled the camera footage that showed him running in after me. My boss gave them the bar footage too. The next day, an officer called me and told me they had identified him as Jared Perez, and that detectives were sending the case to the prosecutor. It would be treated as stalking and unlawful entry because he chased me into the building and tried to force my apartment door open. Hearing those words made everything feel even more real, but also a slight bit reassuring. I went to the courthouse the next day and filed for a restraining order. I had to tell a judge everything that happened, and they looked at the police report and the security video. The judge approved a temporary restraining order right away, and police served him with it soon after. I was told the prosecutor was moving forward with charges related to him trying to break into my apartment. I still worked at the bar for a while after that, but I stopped walking home alone at night. Even with the court order and the charges, I felt scared every time I came back to my building. I would check over my shoulder the whole walk and rush inside as fast as I could. Nothing like that ever happened again, but I never forgot this incident.
When I was a kid, the attic always scared me more than the basement did. I don't really know why. Most people are more afraid of basements, but there was something about our attic that really got to me. If I had to guess, I'd say it was because our attic was slightly unconventional compared to what you're probably picturing. For starters, it was surprisingly spacious. Most attics are typically cramped and congested, which makes sense, but our attic was built in such a way that you didn't ever have to crouch when you were up there. You might think that would imply we used it more often, the same way anyone would use excess space. But no. I'm not really sure why, but my parents treated it like a glorified storage room. That was its sole purpose. Thinking about it now, they honestly avoided it as much as possible. The other thing about it was that it had so many nooks and crannies built into it. What I mean by that is the space was broken up by odd beams and small changes in elevation, almost like a makeshift maze. The beams were of uneven thickness, and there was no pattern to where they appeared. The result was that you couldn't stand in any one place up there and have a clear line of sight from one end to the other, and the uneven flooring was a nightmare. You could genuinely injure yourself up there if you weren't careful. My dad used to joke that one day one of us would slip on one of the joists, fall through the insulation, and puncture a hole in the ceiling. So you can imagine why an attic like that would be scary to a little kid. The maze-like quality was what freaked me out the most. I really didn't like not being able to see the attic in its entirety, and every time I went up there, I felt like someone was hiding behind one of the beams. But anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that I don't have a ton of other memories from that period in my life. For whatever reason, however, this memory is so vivid that it feels like a thorn protruding into what was otherwise a fantastic childhood. It happened during the week, which I remember because I had school that day. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but I was in middle school. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. The bottoms were gray and grimy, and there was this fine layer of grit between my toes that I couldn't explain. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at them, trying to figure out what had happened. I hadn't gone outside the night before. I hadn't done anything unusual. I'd just gone to bed, fallen asleep, and woken up with filthy feet. Being a little kid and all, I didn't give it too much thought beyond that. I just washed my feet in the bathtub and went about my day. Things only escalated from there, though. A few days later, I found a box in my room that didn't belong there. It was this small cardboard box filled with old photographs, the kind my parents kept stored away in the attic. I had no memory of bringing it downstairs, and when I asked my mom about it, she just assumed I'd been rummaging through the attic for some reason. I told her I hadn't, but she didn't seem concerned. She just took the box back upstairs, and that was that. Then it happened again. I woke up one morning and found an old lamp sitting on my desk. This ugly brass thing that I vaguely recognized from the attic. This time I was sure I definitely hadn't brought that down. I would have remembered carrying a lamp through my house in the middle of the night. But there it was, sitting on my desk like it belonged there. That's when things started clicking into place. The dirty feet, the box of photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking. I was sleepwalking to the attic. The realization didn't scare me right away, but it made me feel strange. The idea that I was unconsciously navigating that maze of beams and uneven flooring in the dark, completely unaware of what I was doing, was weird. I told my parents, and they reacted exactly how you'd expect. They said sleepwalking was completely normal, that lots of kids did it, and that I'd probably grow out of it. I wouldn't exactly say they were dismissive, but they weren't overly concerned either. To them, it was just one of those things. But to me, it was more than that. After the next incident, I started dreading bedtime. I'd lie in bed for hours after I was supposed to go to sleep, fighting it because I was terrified of what might happen once I was unconscious. I obviously couldn't fight sleep forever, though, and every morning, I would frantically check my feet to see if they were dirty. If they were clean, it had been a good night. If they were dirty, it had been a bad night. They were usually clean, but those few times they weren't really got to me. There was no denying that I was definitely going up to the attic regularly, and the worst part about the whole thing was that I had no memory of it whatsoever. For all I knew, I was spending more time up there than in my own bed. The fear I felt during that period was different from anything I had ever experienced. It was like this slow, creeping dread that never went away. It was awful, but nothing was scarier than what I'm about to say. I woke up one morning, only it wasn't morning. It was still dark out. It took me a few seconds to realize it, but I wasn't in my bed either. In fact, I wasn't even lying down. I was standing. That was the first thing I registered. I was standing upright in complete darkness, and I had no idea where I was. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't even process it. But then the recognition hit me. I was in the attic. The fear that washed over me was so intense that I almost couldn't breathe. I was in the attic in the middle of the night in pitch black darkness. I couldn't see a single thing, not the beams, not the boxes, not the hatch, nothing. Just absolute impenetrable black. And to make matters worse, I had no idea where in the attic I was. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. It was like sleep paralysis times 100. I knew the layout of the attic, but only vaguely, and only from memory. I also knew there were obstacles everywhere. The idea of trying to find my way back to the hatch in complete darkness was almost unthinkable, but I couldn't just stand there forever. So I started moving, slowly and painfully. I was so scared that I actually started crying, but silently. The tears were just flooding down my face, and I felt like if I made too much noise, something was going to get me. It was the most terrified I've ever been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. I don't know what was giving me that thought, but I could feel something else there with me. Something further in the dark, and as soon as I had that thought, I actually heard something. There was a soft thud from somewhere behind me. It honestly sounded like a footstep, or someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I kept moving, but I heard the sound twice more, and both times it sounded like it was coming from a different spot. At that point, I was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was something else up there with me. I don't know how long it took me to find the hatch, but I eventually did find it. I went straight to my parents' room and woke them up. I was full on bawling at that point. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them what had happened, how I'd had to find my way back in the dark. I told them about the sounds too, and that there was someone in the attic. I expected my dad to spring out of bed and rush up there with a baseball bat, but he didn't. They didn't even really take me seriously. My mom just hugged me and told me it was okay, that sleepwalking could be scary, but it wasn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the attic hatch if it would make me feel better, and I said yes, obviously. But I knew what I heard. I insisted that they at least check the attic, and my dad finally agreed. As I was watching my dad climb up there was a part of me that genuinely thought he wasn't going to make it back. But not 2 minutes later, he was already climbing back down the ladder. He told me there was nothing up there and to go back to sleep. So that's what I did, but lying in bed after that experience was the worst night of my life. After that, the sleepwalking did stop. I'm not sure what I would have done if it had continued, and speaking of that, I've never been able to fully accept the sleepwalking explanation. I know that's the most logical explanation. Sleepwalking is a real thing that happens to people, and there's nothing supernatural about it. But there's this part of me that can't let it go. The way I always ended up in the same place, the attic, never anywhere else in the house, and the way I was apparently capable of navigating the maze of beams and obstacles in complete darkness without even hurting myself. And most of all, that night I woke up standing in the dark. The sounds I heard. I still believe there was something up there with me, I really do. What it was, I have no idea. I'm obviously a lot older now, and I've brought these concerns up to my parents several times, but they always give me the same dismissive answers. It almost feels like they themselves don't want to think about it, which also doesn't make much sense to me. I doubt I'll ever get the answer I'm looking for. This happened when I was 14 or 15. My family lived in this old house that had been passed down for generations. My dad grew up there, and so did his parents before him. I don't live there anymore, but I still think about what I'm about to tell you from time to time. Like most houses, it had an attic. It was basically a graveyard for stuff nobody wanted to deal with, like old furniture, boxes of God knows what, and Christmas decorations. That last one was the only reason anyone ever went up there. Once a year right before the holidays, and then once more to put everything back. This happened around Christmas time, but Christmas has basically nothing to do with the story. That particular Christmas, my dad decided I was finally old enough to grab the decorations myself. He gave me the whole rundown, which boxes to look for, something about the lights being in a separate container near the back wall, and I nodded along like I was paying attention. I wasn't, not really. I was thinking about something else. We finished talking, and he sent me up to the attic. I climbed the ladder and pulled down the little chain to turn on the light. I remember looking around and thinking I genuinely couldn't remember the last time I'd been up there. But then I realized there was a problem. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had actually told me to grab. I couldn't remember any of his instructions, and there was no way I was going back to ask him to repeat himself. My dad had this thing about that. He'd get legitimately pissed off if you made him say something twice, so I just started opening random boxes that looked like they might contain Christmas decorations. I moved stuff around for probably 20 minutes, and I ended up making a complete mess of the place. I did eventually find the Christmas stuff, which spared me the anxiety of having to go back downstairs empty-handed, but the attic was completely disorganized at that point. I made like 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder, hauling everything to the living room. Once I was done, I went back up for one last look to make sure I hadn't missed anything important. I knew I was going to have to reorganize everything up there, which I wasn't looking forward to. As I was looking around the attic, bracing myself for all the stuff I was going to have to move, I saw something up there that looked out of place. In one of the back corners, kind of tucked behind all the stuff I'd moved around, there was this box I hadn't seen before. It was black and didn't look like a flimsy cardboard box, but something sturdier, like a document box or one of those fireproof things. Despite the heavy-duty look, it somehow looked older than everything else up there. Being a curious kid and all, I obviously opened it. Inside were papers, dozens and dozens of them, like an alarming amount. Notebooks, loose pages, some hand-drawn maps, even a few pages of what looked like sheet music. And the one thing they all shared was that they were all completely covered in handwriting. The maps, the notebooks, even the sheet music. I started going through it, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The handwriting was difficult to decipher at first, but the more my eyes adjusted to the lettering, the more I was able to understand. None of the pages were dated, but they seemed to be stacked in chronological order, older stuff on top and newer entries near the bottom. I was so intrigued by that box and those papers that I told myself I wouldn't go back downstairs until I had read each one. The earliest entries were boring. Weather stuff, household tasks, random thoughts about the day. It kind of resembled a disorganized diary, and I was very quickly able to gather that whoever was responsible for writing it all was someone who had previously lived in that house. As I kept reading, though, things got weirder. For starters, the handwriting got slightly more chaotic and illegible, which was the first indication, but that was nothing compared to the content of what I was reading. Whoever wrote all of it had become obsessed with the attic. They kept measuring it. They repeatedly documented the dimensions of the attic over and over, comparing them to the footprint of the house below. According to their math, the attic was smaller than it should have been. There was space along one of the walls, like several feet, that couldn't be accounted for. They went into extreme detail about this one wall, like cracks, indents, marks. Every square inch of what made that wall distinctive was in there. The entries got even more frantic after that. Based on what I was reading, it was clear that whoever had written them was spending hours at a time in the attic, sometimes even sleeping up there. They started hearing sounds from behind that missing space, like scratching, breathing, that sort of thing. There were timestamps to go along with some of the entries, like 2:14 a.m., scratching for approximately 3 minutes. The more I read, the more I realized I was getting a first-hand account of someone's complete descent into madness. There was nothing coherent about any of it, and I didn't believe what they were writing for a second, but it only got worse. The final pages weren't even sentences anymore, just tally marks, rows and rows and rows of them, counting something I couldn't identify, and then the entries just stopped. Either the person had stopped writing them, or that was as far back as the record went. By the time I got through everything, I was genuinely shaking. I wanted to put everything back where I had found it, go back downstairs, and purge the memory of ever reading it from my brain. But there was something I had to do first. My eyes went straight to the wall the writer had been so fixated on, and the moment I realized there were actually some marks in it, I started feeling sick. I examined the wall, and some of the indents and cracks seemed to line up almost exactly with what that guy had been saying. It was a type of freaky I had yet to experience. I can only describe it as the feeling of being watched, but from multiple different angles. I could picture that guy clawing at the attic wall in a fit of lunacy. Felt like he was in there with me. Suddenly, I didn't want to spend another second in that attic. I grabbed the black box and went straight to my dad. He was just as shocked as I was. He had absolutely no idea what any of it meant, and he had definitely never seen it before. He told me he was 100% sure it wasn't his father's handwriting, which meant whoever wrote those entries must have been a person who lived there even before my grandpa. The thing was, his parents were both gone, and he knew absolutely nothing about the people who had lived in the house before them. My dad went up to investigate, and to my surprise, he took me with him. I felt a lot safer having him with me, so I didn't argue. I stood off to the side while my dad inspected the wall more meticulously than I did, using some of the pages as a guide. After a few minutes, he froze up like he was thinking. I thought he had given up, but he turned to me and told me he was going to rip the wall down. I was actually kind of shocked by that, but I was in no position to oppose him. So that's exactly what he did. He ripped that wall down with some tools from the garage, and what we saw was shocking. The writer had been right. There was a space back there, a lot of space. It was several feet deep, and it ran the whole length of the wall. But that wasn't even the worst part. The walls of the hidden space were covered in markings. Black lines, symbols, shapes I didn't even recognize. They covered almost every surface. I don't really know how to describe it, but those marks were something else entirely. They didn't look like writing. The implication was even worse than that, though, because my dad and I soon realized that there was no alternative entrance to that hidden space. So how could someone have ever gotten in there in the first place? My dad and I just stood there, completely overwhelmed by what we were looking at. Eventually, once the initial shock wore off, we confirmed there was nothing else in the space, and there wasn't. The entire room was empty with the exception of whatever was drawn all over the walls. Things didn't end there. The more we thought about the situation, the less it made sense. At one point, my dad pointed out that whoever wrote those notebooks, whoever had been so obsessed with documenting every little detail, did not seem like the type of person who would so neatly organize everything in a little box and tuck it away in a corner. Compulsive behavior doesn't end with tidy archival work. That thought hadn't occurred to me until that moment. But I had to admit, he was right. But that could only mean that someone else had compiled the collection. My dad was 2 steps ahead of me. I watched as this unreadable look washed over his face. It looked like a mix of sadness and confusion. He was quiet for a little, then said it must have been his father, my grandfather. He must have found the writings at some point, gathered them together, and stored them in that box. There wasn't much to do after that. My dad admitted years later that his dad having withheld something like that from him, and why he would even do that in the first place, was something that would eat at him forever. And I don't blame him. As for me, I don't really know what to make of any of it. It happened so long ago that I don't think it matters anymore, but if I think about it for long enough, I can still freak myself out. I don't think anyone can rationalize it. There's no reasonable explanation. I used to think that whoever had written those entries was the same person who had scratched up that hidden space, and that they were probably just insane. But there were things in those pages that someone could only know after the wall was put up. But with the wall being up, there was no other way into that space. It truly makes no sense. My dad wouldn't let me keep the box when we ultimately moved out of that house. For all I know, it's still up there in that attic. All I know is this is a mystery I'll take with me to my grave. I've been a smoker for longer than I care to admit. 23 years now, give or take. At this point, it's less of a habit and more of a ritual. Something to keep my hands busy or to mark the end of a day. The thing is, I refuse to smoke inside. My parents were the same way when they lived here, even though my dad smoked cigars on special occasions. I inherited this house from them about 4 years ago when they finally pulled the trigger and moved down to Florida. They'd been talking about it for years, and I think they just needed to know the house would be in good hands before they could actually leave. I was divorced, living in an apartment that was way too small and depressing, so the timing worked out. My only complaint now is that the house actually feels too big, which sounds absurd until you realize it's a 3-story colonial and I live alone. The house also has this big backyard, probably close to an acre if you count the wooded part, and I've gotten into the habit of taking these late night walks out there while I smoke. It's peaceful. There aren't any neighbors close enough to bother me, and the only light out there comes from my house, So usually it's just me and the crickets and whatever's rustling around in the trees. I usually do a full loop around the property line,